in English or Russian or Belarusian. Thank you so much.
Большое спасибо, Николета, и мы готовы начать. Это для меня доставляет большое удовольствие и честь предоставить слово сейчас для вступительного слова госпоже Светлане Тихановской, избранному лидеру Беларуси. Светлана Георгиевна, пожалуйста, вы в эфире.
Всем здравствуйте, дорогие белорусы, международные партнеры и друзья. Я рада приветствовать вас на международной конференции, посвященной проведению демократических выборов в Беларуси. Невероятно важно, что мы все собрались сегодня с целью обсудить проведение свободных, честных и справедливых выборов для решения кризиса в Беларуси. Почему именно сейчас? Ответ довольно прост. Захват самолета Ryanair в воздушном пространстве Беларуси. Преследование независимого медиапортала Тутбай. Гибель политзаключенного Витольда Ашурка в тюрьме. И самоубийство 17-летнего Дмитрия Стаховского – это лишь часть тех ужасных и трагических событий, которые происходят в нашей стране. И несколько минут назад мы узнали, что активист Степан Латыпов пытался перерезать горло в зале суда, потому что ему угрожали преследованием родственников, если он не признает вину за то, чего не совершал. И все это показывает, что пик беспрецедентных репрессий, которые продолжаются последние 10 месяцев, еще не прошел, и масштаб репрессий только усиливается. Эти события напоминают нам, ничего этого не произошло бы, если бы в августе 2020 года выборы президента Беларуси были свободными и прозрачными. И поэтому нам пора поговорить о досрочных выборах как комплексном решении кризиса в Беларуси. Этой весной почти 800 тысяч белорусов приняли участие в онлайн-голосовании и высказались в поддержку переговоров, ведущих к новым выборам. Эту идею поддержало и международное сообщество, за что мы очень благодарны. И белорусы, и наши международные партнеры понимают, что мы работаем над созданием новой Беларуси, демократической страны, в которой правительство в своих решениях будет опираться исключительно на волю народа. И для этого мы требуем прекратить насилие и освободить всех политических заключенных. Их число на данный момент достигло более 450 человек и постоянно растет. И еще 1000 людей только ожидают официального признания узниками совести. Чувство безнаказанности режима связано с тем, что его представители не были избраны демократическим путем. Они не чувствуют ответственности перед белорусским народом. Они думают, что политика насилия и разжигания страха поможет им удержать власть. И в то же время режим пытается имитировать диалог, выдвигая эффективные инициативы и проводя консультации с тщательно отобранными сообщниками. Это касается и объявленной режимом конституционной реформы, которая не включает никаких реальных изменений или выхода из кризиса. Это просто имитация реформ. Мы не должны позволить им обмануть нас или затормозить реализацию наших планов, особенно когда режим переносит предстоящие выборы в местные органы власти. Мы знаем, что организация новых, свободных и справедливых президентских выборов – это сложный процесс. Именно поэтому мы пригласили наших международных партнеров, в том числе избирательные комиссии демократических стран, для обмена опытом. Сегодня с нами более 200 членов белорусских политических партий и общественных инициатив, представители государственных органов и общественных организаций из других стран. Мы также направили приглашение представителям режима. Мы открыты для диалога с ними, чтобы найти выход из сложившегося кризиса. К сожалению, мы не получили ответа на наше официальное приглашение. Тем не менее, я бы хотела обратиться к белорусским чиновникам правительства, которые сейчас колеблются. Лукашенко проиграл прошлогодние выборы и знает это. Не позволяйте ему затянуть вас за собой в пропасть. Я хочу напомнить, что согласно Конституции, единственным источником власти Беларуси является народ. И вы должны уважать его волю. Я призываю вас поддержать свой народ и вместе со всеми нами строить новую Беларусь. Уважаемые участники, в первый день конференции мы обсудим, каким образом будет осуществлено проведение досрочных выборов в кратчайшие сроки. Второй день будет посвящен теме свободных и справедливых выборов в краткосрочной перспективе, а также долгосрочным реформам, необходимым в новой Беларуси. Возможно, мы не найдем все необходимые ответы за эти 2 дня, но мы затронем актуальные темы, проведем важные обсуждения, и за ними последуют экспертные дискуссии. Буквально через минуту состоится панель высокого уровня с участием представителей Европарламента, Парламентской ассамблеи ОБСЕ и организации International IDEA. Я благодарна, что они смогли присоединиться к нам в этот день. Я знаю, что конгрессмен Билл Китинг не сможет, к сожалению, присоединиться к нам сегодня. Но я только что встретилась с 3 сенаторами США, и я знаю, что американский народ поддерживает нас. Также я благодарна команде экспертов и соорганизаторов IFES, DRI, International IDEA за плодотворное сотрудничество. Я благодарна всем, кто будет присутствовать на конференции, включая представителей европейских центральных избирательных комиссий и их ассоциаций. Мы хотим обсудить, как организовать свободные и справедливые выборы по международным стандартам, и мы готовы поделиться своими идеями. И, дорогие белорусы, пока международное сообщество закрывает свои двери для режима, эти же двери открываются для народа Беларуси и новой страны, которую мы с вами строим. И свободные и честные выборы – это залог новой демократической Беларуси. Так давайте создавать ее вместе. Спасибо вам большое.
Большое спасибо, Светлана. Я сейчас передаю слово госпоже Беате Мартин-Разумилович, которая будет модератором панели высокого уровня. И первым спикером в панели будет опять Светлана Георгиевна Тихановская, но перед этим, пожалуйста, Беата, я передаю слово вам.
Many thanks, Alex, and many thanks to the partners who have participated in organizing this event. I thank you, everyone who is joining us today from around the world, for what I believe is going to be a very important conversation. Belarus is at a crossroads. As we see, there is continual societal demand for genuine and democratic elections in the country since the last presidential contest last August. As many of you know, no elections in Belarus have been found to meet international standards, according to observers. And this continues to be a pivotal issue since elections are envisaged as being a conflict resolution mechanism to change diverse interests and channel them through democratic structures. So it's with this in mind that we've brought together this eminent panel of individuals to discuss issues surrounding how such a process might serve as a dialogue for reducing and perhaps ameliorating tensions in the country. This panel will focus on the current state of affairs in Belarus, the origins of the crisis and its political and human rights dimensions. And speakers will also discuss why the current political crisis in Belarus matters from an international perspective and how it can be resolved through democratic means. Our first panelist, Ms. Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who has just spoken, needs no introduction, And so without further ado, I pass the floor to her for her remarks on this important theme before continuing with the other panelists who I will introduce. Over to you, Ms. Тихановская.
Спасибо, Беата, и я постараюсь в своем выступлении ответить на предложенные вопросы. Недавние события, несомненно, потрясли весь мир. Продолжающееся преследование независимых СМИ, которое привело к блокировке Тутбай. Бушующие репрессии в отношении гражданского сообщества, которые привели к гибели еще 2 ни в чем не виновных людей. И, наконец, вопиющее игнорирование правил международной гражданской авиации, которое привело к беспрецедентному акту организованного государством воздушного пиратства. Но все эти события лишь часть всепоглощающего кризиса и безнаказанности режима. И теперь это опасности не только для 9 миллионов белорусов, но и реально угроза международному миру и безопасности. И все эти события – это результат очередных сфальсифицированных выборов. Граждане Евросоюза на борту самолета Ryanair были заложниками в аэропорту Минска в течение 7 часов, а белорусы – заложники в своей стране почти 27 лет. И нелегитимный режим, неподотчетный своему народу, опасен для тех, кто находится в Беларуси и за ее пределами, поскольку он решил сделать все возможное, чтобы оставаться у власти. Они думают о краткосрочной перспективе и стараются выжить как можно дольше. Вот почему народ Беларуси испытывает нарастающее давление. И концепция всеобъемлющей безопасности закреплена в ОБСЕ, и я ожидаю, что эта организация поддержит нас в поисках решения кризиса. И это уже не просто белорусский вызов, это действительно международный вызов. Есть ли место для оптимизма в краткосрочной и долгосрочной перспективе, спрашиваете вы, и я хотела бы быть оптимистом, но также нужно быть и реалистом. Мы выбрали исключительно мирные и демократические решения. Они требуют времени и настойчивости со стороны нашего народа. Но эти решения правильные, потому что они ориентированы на долгосрочные результаты. Нам необходимо проводить демократические реформы с долгосрочными положительными последствиями. Мы не можем допустить нового авторитарного режима или отката назад в реформах. Цена, уже заплаченная нами, слишком высока. И наши люди – источник моего оптимизма. Они показали себя непобедимыми в этом марафоне, который вначале оказался спринтом. Они упорно борются за свои ценности и права человека. Сотни тысяч белорусов, как я уже говорила, поддерживают переговоры, и мы готовы реализовать это решение. Предварительные консультации должны установить предмет переговоров в качестве первого шага. Разрешение текущего политического кризиса – это тройной процесс, потому что, во-первых, это реформа политической системы, восстановление верховенства закона и уважение прав человека. Во-вторых, национальный диалог и примирение на основе освобождения всех политических заключенных и их реабилитации. И третье и центральное место в этом всем процессе – это новые, свободные и справедливые выборы. Так ОБСЕ может выступить площадкой для предварительных контактов и консультаций. Отдельные государства, имеющие опыт работы с подобными кризисами, могут стать эффективными посредниками. И в результате они будут гарантами безопасности и политической стабильности не только в Беларуси, но и во всем регионе. Свободные и справедливые президентские выборы в Беларуси – это инструмент для решения кризиса, поскольку сфальсифицированные выборы являются источником этого кризиса. И по этому вопросу на самом деле существует консенсус как внутри страны, так и на международном уровне. Голоса белорусов были украдены, и теперь нам нужно вернуть их людям. И завтра мы подробно обсудим этот процесс, а сегодня мы сосредоточимся на самой идее выборов. В ходе переговоров нам нужно будет обсудить, кто проведет новые президентские выборы. Поскольку люди не доверяют нынешней Центральной избирательной комиссии, нам нужно будет создать новую. А что касается права баллотироваться кандидатам, то ответ ясен. Мы будем строго соблюдать Конституцию и избирательный кодекс. Выборы пройдут под международным наблюдением и в соответствии с международными избирательными стандартами. И мы будем приветствовать всех местных и международных наблюдателей, которые пожелают приехать в Беларусь. Существующая правовая база – это еще одна проблема, которую мы пытаемся решить, разрабатывая правила и инструкции. Мы должны иметь возможность проводить свободные и справедливые выборы без немедленного внесения поправок в избирательный кодекс, поскольку время для нас очень ценно. На этом я закончу свое выступление. Пожалуйста, прошу продолжать. Спасибо. Звук вас не слышно.
Спасибо большое, Светлана. Thank you very much. And our next speaker, we have Ms. Klára Dobrev from the European Parliament. Klára is a Hungarian politician and vice president of the European Parliament. She holds a degree in economics from the Budapest University of Economics and also a law degree from Eötvös Loránd University of Arts and Sciences. She's held several governmental positions in the past, including as chief of cabinet to Mr. Péter Megdaszi during the 2001 to 2002 election, and also as vice president of the Office of National Development Plan and EU Support. In 2019, she was elected as a member of the European Parliament and subsequently elected as its vice president in July 2019. And it's with great pleasure that we welcome her to the event today. And I pass the floor to you, Ms. Dobrev.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Beata. Allow me to say a few words in Russian. Дорогие друзья, спасибо большое за приглашение. И разрешите только некоторые слова сказать на русском языке, потому что мы здесь в Европейском парламенте, в Европейском Союзе смотрели с ужасом, что случилось в последние месяцы в Беларуси или в Минске. И я хотела вам сказать, что со своего сердца, со целое сердце мы стоим на стороне демократов в Беларуси. Мы стоим на вашей стороне, госпожа Тихановская, и мы будем все сделать, чтобы помогать Беларуси, чтобы миллионы человек, которые хотят свободы, которые хотят демократии, чтобы могли жить в одном стране, где они тоже важны, не только Лукашенко. And now let me to go on and continue in English because, well, that's a little bit easier for me. But it was a great pleasure to hear and listen to you, Madam Tianovskaya. And again, from my whole heart, I really wish you success. And I would like to tell you that we in the European Union are doing everything what is possible in order to bring back Belarus to the European path and to the democratic path. Because, I mean, that's obvious. Lukashenko started to go towards North Korea. Everything what he's doing is in the same way. And millions of Belarusian people told him and telling him ongoing on the streets, in the media and everywhere that stop, it was enough. It's a nightmare and it must end. And today in this discussion, there are going to be a lot of experts, people who know a lot about election law, about constitution, how to organize and how to develop new pieces of legislation. So I'm definitely not the person who is going to say and tell you exactly what is the way to organize the new election and what is the way to organize the new constitution and the new way of the new democratic Belarus. But let me share you a few rather painful, actually, experiences and some thoughts, what maybe you should bear in mind. And I'm sharing this not only as a vice president of the European Parliament, but I'm sharing it with you as a Hungarian politician. And maybe this is something which is really important. First of all is that whatever happens and however we can think about the new way, how the new democratic Belarus looks like, you should concentrate on institutions. Because, individuals and people, they might go wrong. No matter how great women and men are entering the politics now, it's important to have a really rock solid institution. Let me share you a good example. President Donald Trump, the former president of the United States, well, he was really trying to build a strong power, an uncontrolled power. And he failed because the democratic institutions were strong enough. And a painful example, or a shameful even, I would say, a regretful one, is Hungary, where once a liberal Democrat, a young liberal Democrat, turned to the illiberal dictator, and the democratic institution of the Hungarian country and of Hungary were not strong enough. And definitely this is something what we have to learn from this lesson, that Belarus and Hungary as well, we need rock solid institutions. So when you are starting to design the new Belarus, you should always think of very strong institutional checks and balances. Second, I don't know when there's going to be election and a new constitution, but I know something for sure, that it will come. And our task in Europe and in Belarus and in the United States is to help this process to come as soon as possible. But whatever you design, a new electoral law, a new constitution, it's going to be great. It's going to be in consensus, and it's going to be a very good piece of legislation. But it's definitely not going to be perfect, because nothing is perfect. I can assure you that there's going to come, I'm sorry, just, hello? Yes. There's going to come someone who will say that, well, let's change it. Let's make new rules. Let's make new pieces of legislation just to adjust it as soon as possible to the new requirements. And my suggestion is, I'm sorry, I just have some connection problem. And my suggestion is that you should not, you should definitely not. And you should make it slowly. Don't do it in a hurry. Because the stability of these pieces of legislation, the stability of the election law, the stability of the constitution, the stability of these core pieces of legislation, which creates a constitutional system in a country, it's more important than any rapid changes. So temptation to modify, you should resist it and maybe take your time and to have this double guaranteed consensus over a period. And the third one, and I think this is something what you are definitely learning now, defeating illiberal leaders. You can do it only in broad coalition. People coming from different backgrounds, political parties which in normal circumstances would compete among each other, because that's what democracy is about. And now they have to cooperate. And they have to build a coalition before election. And I know this is difficult. Sometimes you do not only have to make some political compromises, you have to make some personal compromises. There might be people who you like in the coalition, and there might be people who you don't really like. But the main goal is to bring back our people, our nation to the democratic path, to the European future, is much more important than any differences before among us. So that's why I am a great supporter of a coalition, and after the election of a coalition government again. Living more than 10 years in an illiberal state makes me a big fan of coalition governments. Because, you know, in coalition you have a lot of debates, sometimes hot-tempered, but every single decision which is taken after the debate, even a hot-tempered debate, is better than a decision taken by a strong leader or a dictator or an autocrat. So definitely this is something what we have to learn when we are fighting illiberal dictators. And if you would allow me at the end to turn not only to the people of Belarus, but to the people in Europe, in the United States as well. To protect democracy, it's not a domestic politics anymore, especially not in a globalized world. When we are trying to help Belarus people, when we are trying to help to restore after 27 years the democracy in Belarus, when we are trying and doing our best to help the opposition, then we are helping ourselves as well. Because democracy is something that you have to protect every day, even if you think that you are living in it. You know, Democrats who fall asleep and do not protect their democracies, they might wake up in dictatorship, because the political evil never sleeps, and we should protect ourselves. And that's a reason, a plus reason to help Belarus and to help you. And thank you very much again for inviting me to this conference. И я желаю вам успеха, и вы всегда можете на меня рассчитать. Я все буду сделать, чтобы вы успели в Беларуси построить демократическая страна. Спасибо.
Thank you very much, Ms. Dobrev, and especially for that focus in democratic institutions, which is really crucial. And I'd just like to add that Ms. Dobrev is now a candidate for the Prime Minister position in Hungary, and so we'll be watching that with great anticipation. Our next panelist is replacing for Congressman Bill Keating, who could unfortunately not make it. And so it's my pleasure to have next Ms. Courtney Austrian, who is Chargé d'Affaires at the US Mission for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. She is a 25-year veteran of the US Diplomatic Corps and a member of the Senior Foreign Service. She arrived in Vienna to serve as the Deputy Chief of Mission in August 2020. But before that, she had also been on various overseas postings, including in Georgia, Ukraine, Russia, Syria, and Haiti. She has received her BA from Swarthmore College and an MBA in Public and Nonprofit Administration from Boston University, as well as an MS in National Security Strategy from the National War College. So I pass the floor over to you, Ms. Austrian.
Thank you so much, and it's a real pleasure to join you this afternoon. As I am a somewhat last-minute replacement, I will probably be a little bit briefer than I would otherwise be, but I can assure you that the United States support for the people of Belarus is consistent and is strongly expressed on a regular basis, both in Washington and around the world. And we, as a government, continue to be amazed by the strength, the resilience, and the courage of the Belarusian people as they demand to have their voices heard. And in the face of the rising repression, they have continued this very active and vibrant movement, and they have our full support. Speaking personally, I as you alluded to, I am at the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and I can assure you that the Belarusian cause comes up in a regular basis in our permanent council meetings, and is something that we speak to on a regular basis, and continue to really shine the spotlight on the activities of the regime there, and also on the very brave people who are working to affect change. And one of the things that we have done here at the OSCE was we launched the Moscow mechanism, and the United States was very proud to be one of a large number of countries that was behind the instigation of the Moscow mechanism, which really did go in and take a very close look at the repressive measures that the regime employed, particularly in the elections last year. And we very much welcomed the expert report that Professor Benedict published following a very, very intense investigation. But that report also provides a roadmap for reforms, and it gives a really good sense as to what opportunities exist. And it is unfortunate that the Lukashenko regime has not actually engaged with the OSCE, has not engaged with that report. The OSCE has really expressed a great deal of willingness and interest in working with the Belarusian people to try to find some kind of resolution. And I think that I can say that we continue to really work to try to make that possible. And here in Vienna, as well as in capitals around the world, we work with our partners on a regular basis. So we're very proud to support the International Accountability Platform from Belarus, which provides a mechanism for further actions that can be taken. And it allows the UN OHCR the resources that it needs in order to hold people to account. And in closing, really all I want to say is that we're really very committed to close coordination. And this is something that is in the United States. It's not one side of the aisle or the other. Republicans and Democrats alike are very focused on what is happening in Belarus. We support, the United States supports international efforts to independently look into the human rights abuses, the crackdown. We support free and fair elections. And we stand with the Belarusian people and their aspirations for a democratic, prosperous future. And events such as the Ryanair diversion of last week, I was trying to find the right word. These are provocative. They are not helpful. And we really do seek to find some democratic and appropriate solution. And so I'm sorry that you got stuck with me and not the congressman today, but I'm very passionate about this subject, and I'm delighted to have had the opportunity to join you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Austrian, and we really appreciate you coming in to speak today, and the role of the OSCE and its continued focus on the Belarusian situation, as well as the particular focus from the US delegation, has been noted over many years, and so that I think also contributes to a dialogue and to possible solutions. Thank you very much for speaking. Our next speaker on the list is Mr. Roberto Montella. He has assumed his duties as Secretary General of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly in 2016 and was re-elected recently for a second 5-year mandate starting on the 1st of January 2021. Mr. Montella previously served as in the International Secretariat of the OSCPA as the Director of the Presidential Administration, and he's held positions at OSCE field missions in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Kosovo, Serbia, Montenegro, as well as a range of advisory, peace building, and management functions. He's also served as the head of the OSCE South Serbia Regional Office and the head of the European Center for Minority Issues in Kosovo. Mr. Montella has taken part in dozens of election observation missions in the OSCE area and in the Middle East, and he's also served as coordinator of the long-term observers for the Carter Center. He served as political advisor to an Italian senator and to the PACE vice president, among other advisory roles that he's held. So over to you, Mr. Montella.
Thank you very much, Beata. You have reminded me of my CV, which sometimes I forget. Thank you very much to inviting me to this conference, and I also want to greet Ms. Tikhanovskaya, Svetlana, and Vice President Dobrev, dear Clara. We had good meetings in Brussels recently, and thank you for the words you have expressed in this conference. Thank you very much for inviting me to address the opening panel of this conference. As the Secretary General of the Parliamentary Assembly that counts Belarus as a member, and that is particularly active in election observation activities, I'm particularly glad to be with you today and to highlight the international perspective coming from a body that was created to build bridges and provide an effective platform for dialogue. In the name of shared values and commitments, the OSCPA is a friend of Belarus, and we always remember the exceptional hospitality that the Belarusian authorities put together for us in our annual session in 2017 in Minsk, And if one considers what has happened since last summer, I would maybe advise, or maybe we can circulate in this chat, to go back and listen to the opening remarks that President Lukashenko made at our annual session in Minsk, and the content of that presentation, and to look at it through the perspective of what has happened in the last months. It's very telling, I must say. It is unfortunate that there are no representatives of the Belarusian authorities here. I was hoping to see my dear friend and colleague Andriy Savitnik, the head of the Belarus delegation, and I understand they have been invited. I was hoping to discuss also with them and all together, and also use this event today to renew our commitment towards Belarus and reiterate once again our Assembly's readiness to support Belarus overcome these challenging times. I agree that election reform could serve to build confidence between all stakeholders, with past recommendations offered by the OSCE ODIHR, offering a ready and available roadmap. I also share the difficulties in how to define the episode of the Ryanair flight. I'll just say the Ryanair flight has generated a level of uncertainty on what could be next expected. This should be kept in mind in the elaboration and the implementation of new policies towards Belarus, both at the multilateral and bilateral level. Our Assembly, for instance, in its repeated attempts to offer a lending hand, has always prioritized an all-inclusive approach based on a corporate OSCE sense of collective responsibility and accountability. I have spared no efforts, and you know that, in trying to breed and perpetrate this approach within our Assembly. And it is exactly this very spirit which brings me today to this conference. Our Assembly has produced many innovative ideas and proposals aimed at helping resolve the crisis, not least through the promotion of dialogue with all, and I underline all sides involved. We have never compromised on serious violations of human rights and fundamental freedoms, and we will continue to do so. Our MPs, by definition and practice, represent people, and consequently, they stand for their rights and freedoms. And this is the specificity and also the added value of our Assembly, the combination of strategic policy, the use of interparliamentary and intraparliamentary assembly, the use of channels of dialogue, and most importantly, the rights of the more than 1 billion people we serve. We will continue also through our very attentive Human Rights Committee to define the rights of the same people that our MPs represent. Now, this conference is about elections, so let me come to elections, which are the overarching topic. Simply put, one cannot speak about democratic solutions without elections, even if, of course, we should also not equate an election with democracy. It is not sufficient. Nevertheless, early elections are sometimes a solution for resolving a political crisis. This is also one of the several other recommendations by the OSCE Moscow Mechanism rapporteur, Wolfgang Benedek, who was quoted earlier. But how can election be effective? To be effective, new elections would have to meet OSCE and international standards and be observed by the OSCE, which was unfortunately not the case in the last 2020 elections. Belarus has held many elections over the years. I was myself in Belarus in 2010 observing the elections in a team with President Tokayev, who was at that time the vice president of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. So I've seen how elections are conducted in Belarus. But OSCE observer missions have consistently found significant failings in these processes. Our missions are not intended to criticize, but aim to contribute to democratic development. Our work is carefully grounded in the commitments that all OSCE countries, including Belarus, have made in the 1990 Copenhagen document. We assess compliance on the basis of these clear criteria, holding countries to the commitments they have themselves freely have already agreed on. As a result of previous OSCE observer missions over the past several decades, as already mentioned previously, there is a clear set of recommendations which, if implemented, can significantly improve the electoral process. I will not pretend that the road ahead is easy, but at least these recommendations give a broad map of the direction to go. The question, as it is often the case, relates to political will to implement those. It is not for me to say, but these recommendations already put forward by respected international organizations, which Belarusian authorities have long participated in, could form a useful basis for discussion among opposing groups, finding common ground on democratic improvements would be a clear demonstration that parties are working on behalf of the entire people of Belarus. Needless to say that we will continue in the future to contribute to electoral support, including through observation. Our assembly stands ready to support Belarus in overhauling its electoral legislation, implementing other important reforms, but also in calling for confidence-building measures and promoting dialogue. Dialogue is indeed the key word here. It is always the key word. The most effective and long-lasting solutions are always reached through dialogue. I have worked, as Beata mentioned, for many years in Southeast Europe, trying to be a bridger between opposing sides. And I'm a strong believer that if you have a honest dialogue and you engage honestly with those you have a disagreement with, we can find a common solution. It can be harsh dialogue sometimes, no doubt, but if there is goodwill to work for the people, it will ultimately conduct to a positive outcome. So this is to sum up my plea to all of you, to all sides in Belarus, including those who have decided not to attend today, that you are part of the same great country. So come together at the same table, and the OSCE and the rest of the international community stands ready to support you. Thank you.
Thank you, Roberto, for stressing that importance of dialogue and the continued engagement with Belarus and with the Belarusian authorities. As you mentioned, this was envisaged as an open, transparent event, which is being broadcast to the world. And there was an open invitation to various members from the Belarusian government and from the authorities there. So it's quite a shame that we can't have that dialogue in the way that was envisaged, but we very much welcome having a discussion which is open and which is inclusive of all sides. And I think that's very crucial to any kind of forward thinking in terms of how elections can be held, which would be in line with international standards. And as Roberto has mentioned, international observers have noted past problems with that regard. Our next speaker is Mr. Kevin Casas-Zamora, who is Secretary General of International IDEA since August 2019. Mr. Casas-Zamora has more than 25 years of experience in democratic governance, focused on electoral systems and democratic institutions, as well as practical experience at a high level as a public official in his home country, as well as multilateral organizations. Until recently, he was a member of Costa Rica's Presidential Commission for State Reform, and also a managing director at Analítica Consultores. Previously, he was Costa Rica's second vice president and Minister of National Planning, and also Secretary for Political Affairs at the Organization for American States, as well as other key roles in other institutions. Mr. Casas-Zamora holds a law degree from the University of Costa Rica, a master's in government from the University of Essex, and a PhD in political science from the University of Oxford. He has authored several studies on campaign finance, elections, democratization, citizen security, and civil-military relations in Latin America. So in his address, Mr. Casas-Zamora will be looking at two particular questions in our program, namely, why has the goal of new elections as the output of negotiations been supported internationally? And what aspects of holding new elections should be agreed upon during any negotiations? So the floor is yours, Kevin, please.
Thank you so much, Beata, for the kind introduction. Before I start answering your questions, please allow me to say how glad I am that this discussion is taking place. It is immensely important and timely, both for Belarus, but also for democratic forces around the world. I'm truly honored that International IDEA is working together with the pro-democracy camp in Belarus and is coordinating this event alongside our friends at IFES and DRI. And I would also like to express my compliments, gratitude, and respect for Svitlana Tikhanovskaya and her team. You have become the symbol of hope and change for millions of people, both within and outside of Belarus, who want to see a democratic future in your country. And both I and all of International IDEA's staff and our 33 member states stand ready to support you and all the democratic forces in Belarus on this journey. To the question, why has the goal of new elections as the output of eventual negotiations been supported internationally? Well, there's a short and there's a long answer to that question. The short answer is simply that this is a goal that needs to be supported because the last election was neither fair, free, or credible. And rather than a testament of democracy, it was a testament of dictatorial desperation and of a regime that is prepared to beat, maim, imprison, and kill its citizens just to stay in power. And mind you, the last elections were certainly the visible trigger to the current impasse, but in fact, they were no more than the culmination of decades of undemocratic elections, repression, and intimidation. So that's the short answer. The longer answer, and this has been mentioned here already, the longer answer has to do with the truly foundational role that free and fair elections have in the making of a new democratic settlement. For any country, properly managed and conducted elections provide the only sound basis for an orderly transition of power and a legitimate political arrangement. And it is only through properly managed and conducted elections that one of the true virtues of democracy, namely its inherent ability to correct its course of action and changing those in power, it can come to life. But what do we mean when we say properly managed and conducted elections? Simply put, we mean elections where all citizens can freely and safely express their views on who should represent them and their votes are taken into account, where freedom of expression, of assembly, and of the press is guaranteed, where repression of or intimidation against the opposition, media, or civil society are not tolerated, where independent observers are allowed to scrutinize the process, where electoral disputes can be resolved by independent courts, and most of all, where incumbents hand over power when defeated. These are the elements that form the type of elections all countries, including Belarus, but also existing democracies, should strive for. And in the case of Belarus, we all know that none of these conditions were met during the last election or the ones before. Through regressive constitutional and legislative changes since the mid-90s, Belarus's electoral management institutions can no longer be considered independent. The president of Belarus looms over the entire electoral process. You asked me why the international community supports the idea of new elections. Well, first of all, because the alternatives are too awful to contemplate. The alternatives are the status quo or a violent rupture of it. And as in so many other cases, new credible elections offer the best peaceful route to a new political settlement that is legitimate, representative, and hopefully stable. The role of the international community in promoting and technically supporting national authorities to hold elections in line with internationally agreed standards goes back at least 20 years. But in the case of Belarus, a meaningful reform has never been implemented or even attempted. If we, the international democratic community who go around saying that we defend and promote democracy worldwide, shy away from supporting Belarus in this critical time with organizing new elections, then we would be making a conscious decision to corner the Belarusian people into two awful alternatives. Either acquiescence in the face of authoritarian, vile, and corrupt rule, or violence. But I would add that there's another crucial reason why the democratic forces in Belarus obviously deserve our support. Because in this time of democratic skepticism and lack of self-confidence, when so many voices out there are sowing doubts about the future of democracy, when so many voices out there are embracing the mirage of authoritarian efficacy, people in Belarus, as in Hong Kong, are reminding us that the demand for democracy is alive and kicking. That liberal democracy is not a geopolitical imposition of a cabal of wealthy North Atlantic countries, but that it actually speaks to profound needs in human nature felt across cultures. Belarus, after all, is not a destitute country where people are going out on the streets against the government because they're starving. They're demonstrating by the millions because, as French writer Antoine de Saint-Exupéry is supposed to have said, humankind is not merely a herd that expects to be fed. That's the key argument in favor of democracy. It is the only political system that treats us as something more than underage dupes in need of tutelage. And in doing so, is the only political system that respects our inherent dignity as human beings. That's what the brave people in Belarus are reminding us of today, and I thank them for that. And perhaps I could go into what I think are the conditions that should be agreed upon during negotiations in order to hold credible elections in Belarus. Perhaps I could go into that during the Q&A. So I'll leave it at that for the time being. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin, and especially for focusing on those fundamental rights issues and the importance of democratic institutions in solving possible conflict and in leading to negotiations and possible settlement. So with that, we will now open the floor to questions and answers from the audience. And we already have one from a journalist in Ukraine, Ms. Natalia Karchenko. And she wants to thank the participants for an insightful discussions, but asks whether you could please share your opinion on what the key problems Belarus may face at the first stage of preparation for early elections, and also what solutions to these problems or challenges can you suggest in order to defend democracy? So I was thinking perhaps Ms. Clara and Courtney can look at the political challenges, and maybe Mr. Roberto and Kevin can also look at the electoral issues, but I turn the floor over to who would like to go first. Clara, would you like to maybe start? And I think you're muted.
I don't know whether I've heard everything because I had some problems with the election, but the question was what can Belarus face in the upcoming months? That was the key second problems, part of the question, what I got.
Key problems that they may face at the first stages of preparations and what solutions might be proposed to defend democracy.
Yes. Well, as you know, immediately the European Parliament suggested sanctions against the regime of Lukashenko, and we are going on in this path, and we are not going to let down the people of Belarus. I'm responsible for the so-called Euronest program of the European Union, and Belarus actually should be one of the countries participating in this program, but we are not going to allow them to take part in this program anymore. This is actually, it's not only about knowledge transfer, it's not only about cooperation, it's about financial support as well to important projects in the Euronest countries. And the government of Lukashenko is simply not validated to distribute any funds on behalf of the European Union. I think this would be very important together with our allies. Finally, I can say again, in the United States, to make a very strict and concrete program and to coordinate our next steps against the Lukashenko regime. And we always have to watch toward Russia as well to see whether President Putin has plans with Belarus, what is he trying to do? And we have exactly because of that way to join our forces, Europe and the United States, to force the Belarus authorities to release the prisoners, to hold a new election, and put an enormous pressure on this, well, call it in the name, dictatorship.
Thank you, Clara. Ms. Austen, would you like to comment?
I think that one of the very first, you asked about elections, one of the very first components is a willingness and openness to dialogue, and looking at actually engaging and being willing to move forward. I don't know that it's a lack of knowledge or information. I think that, as Roberto discussed in his remarks, the ODIHR from OSCE is more than willing to assist in helping with elections. Within the United States, that we have many different parts of our government, as well as nonprofit organizations that are also well positioned to be able to help in terms of staging democratic elections. As Clara discussed, there, of course, are issues related to disinformation that would also need to be addressed. But what it really requires is a willingness and an openness. And we encourage the Belarusian government to take advantage of the opportunities that have been made available to it. The OSCE chairperson in office, which is Sweden, has expressed frequent willingness to engage with the authorities in brokering a dialogue between the government, the so-called government, and the democratic those people who are pursuing democracy in Belarus, including Ms. Sikhanouskaya. This is not a new effort, but it does require a willingness to engage. And the OSCE is a wonderful place for that to take place because we are all members of this organization. I sit across the table from my Belarusian colleague on a regular basis. We are able to talk to each other. So if we can't do it here, this is the place to do it.
Indeed, it is the place to do it, and that is the format for having these kinds of discussions. So thank you very much for those thoughts. Over to you, Roberto, for your input on this question.
Thank you very much, Beata. I actually just heard the representative of the US mission in Vienna. Finally, I can see you all because I see myself on the screen. I find it difficult to talk to myself now. I see your faces. I totally agree with what Austrian was saying. I mean, it's the first stumbling block here is the willingness of the authorities in Minsk to engage in a dialogue with the international community and first and foremost with their opposition. If that doesn't take place, I mean, we can discuss on the modality of the electoral process, whether it's appropriate to change election laws 6 months before an election or not, or when a longer term electoral reform should take place. There is the acquis, there is the OSCE recommendation. So the entire package is available. What is missing here is that on the one side, there is the authorities who say, no, we don't want to engage with the group that Svetlana Tikhanovskaya represents, but also with others. They say, I don't know if this is the case also in their penal code, but I mean, some of them are even accused as being terrorists. So we are the stumbling block. The authorities say no dialogue with the opposition. The international community is saying, let's try to sit together and talk and give them a chance to represent their concerns. And we are ready to be a platform, not in a platform, especially in the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. We are not here pointing fingers or accusing, which is, of course, underlining the defense of the shared values and commitments that Belarus has made. But we are ready to engage with the authorities. But if from that side there is a no to any kind of engagement with the international community, a total blockade with any connection with the opposition, we have tried. Svetlana was part of a panel with the head of the Belarus delegation to the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly in September. They both presented their positions. There was a kind of a discussion, but that's, I think, to my knowledge, Svetlana will be able to clarify that. To my knowledge, is the last time that there was actually a face-to-face discussion with the Minsk authorities. And so if that doesn't happen, what are the tools that the international community has in order to foster a dialogue or move forward? I mean, there are tools that we know in the OSCE, calling a country to respect its shared values and commitments, or what in diplomacy is called naming and shaming. There are other tools that are applied, like sanctions, bigger sanctions, smaller sanctions. We, OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, promote dialogue, but of course, dialogue requires two to tango. So once you have exhausted these tools of the international diplomacy, what are the other tools? I mean, there are more robust tools, but I mean, of course, we're not going to advocate more robust tools. So I do not know what, how you come out of this if not finding a way to ask the authorities in Minsk to make a beau geste and to kind of move forward. But what has happened recently, it's maybe giving me a more pessimistic, let's say, perspective. I don't want to be I mean, normally trying to always bring a positive posture. So I would like to remain optimist, but I do not see much elements to remain optimist in this moment. And all our efforts, however noble they are, and you know, I am here representing also Belarus in the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. Some will say, why are you engaging with a side which we consider a terrorist side? You know, like, of course, I mean, I have no problem. I feel that it's appropriate and correct for me because I talk to all sides. But this is the starting position. So how we come out of this, if there is anybody cleverer here, I will very much want to learn that. Sorry to be too less official than what I was given to read, but I was told to be very sticking to my script, so I did. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Roberto. And I think it's exactly that question of what tools do we have to be able to, you know, create the societal dialogue that's necessary and has been necessary for some time. And it's exactly with that in mind that these discussions are taking place, and hopefully some interesting thoughts will come out of that. But thank you for highlighting that. Kevin, to you for your thoughts.
Sure, thank you. Beata, I think, you know, this is a good moment to reflect a little bit on the conditions that should be agreed upon during a process of dialogue in order to have credible elections. I mean, we've already talked at length about the need for elections to be part of any solution to the current impasse. So, but there are a number of conditions that need to be met. To start with, political repression has to stop, and political prisoners must be freed, and this should be non-negotiable. And moreover, the incumbent government must guarantee freedom of expression, of assembly, and of the press. And this is something that I want to insist on, because you know, in my part of the world where I come from, we've had these discussions around the case of Venezuela for a long time. And one of the points that has been raised repeatedly is that, yes, you know, there are two parties to this dialogue, two parties to this dispute, but they're not equivalent. The role of guaranteeing freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and freedom of the press falls squarely within the purview of the government. It is the government and only the government that needs to guarantee those things. So that's number one. Second, the country needs an independent electoral authority approved by both the opposition and the current government and that enjoys public trust. Without that, no credible election is possible. Third, an inclusive and transparent process for preparing the first democratic elections need to be put in place and with some haste because there's a tight timeline of between 30 and 70 days, according to the Constitution. So at a minimum, that process must make sure that voter lists are publicly available and can be scrutinized by voters. That safeguards are introduced to protect the integrity of early voting, particularly if the election is held during the pandemic. That the transparency of the vote count is guaranteed, including by publishing the results at every polling station. And that an independent and efficient system of electoral dispute resolution is put in place. Fourth, and this has been mentioned already, credible international observers must be allowed to witness the elections. And this is one of the key elements for building trust, to build buy-in and international recognition of the outcome of the elections. And fifth, Belarus requires serious electoral reform, anchored, and this has been mentioned already, in the OSCE, ODIHR, and Venice Commission recommendations. The cornerstone of this reform must be protecting the independence of election management institutions. Given the very tight deadline to organize the election, this will be difficult to achieve before the election, but it needs to be agreed upon from the outset. And only such a legal and institutional reform can set the proper foundation for future democratic, free, and fair elections, and that can reflect the will of the people of Belarus. And this last point is key. It is vital to look beyond a single election and adopt measures that ensure democratic consolidation in the long term. I mean, we know from decades of experience with democratic transitions that an election is not a quick fix for becoming a democracy overnight. And particularly in countries that have experienced prolonged periods of authoritarian rule, democratic consolidation will play out over many, many electoral cycles. And the practical implication of this is that elections should not be seen as solutions to structural problems, but rather as instruments that contribute to broader transitional processes defined over time by principles of constitutionalism and the rule of law, by the operation of a variety of political parties, and by the presence of free media and a vibrant civil society. You know, these processes are very complex. And they also, by the way, involve very thorny issues of timing and sequencing, and also unpleasant choices. And that was mentioned before by Clara Dobrev in her remarks. And I think it's very wise that she mentioned this. In a particularly difficult, but indispensable, often indispensable choice, concerns the need to consider introducing amnesty and transitional justice arrangements. And this means, in short, that it might be necessary to offer incentives for those in government to secure a democratic and peaceful resolution and avert an escalation to the crisis. But it's very important to bear in mind that transitional arrangements should be time-bound and not become permanent. And I guess, and with this I finish, I mean, this speaks to a more general point. Democratic transitions are inherently messy. And decisions made at the initial stages can really cast a long shadow over the long-term prospects of a democracy. And unfortunately, the international experience in these matters is abundant. There is a lot to learn from all regions in the world, and we at International IDEA, we will be supporting the pro-democratic forces in Belarus every step of the way. I mean, to share and discuss those lessons from the international experience, but more generally, simply to support the people that are fighting the good fight for principles that are dear to all of us.
Thank you, Kevin. And thank you specifically for mentioning those various technical aspects and the importance that they have in having genuine and democratic elections, but also the meaning that has in the bigger political context and the democratic picture. So thank you for your thoughtful responses on that. The next question we have from David Kramer at Florida International University, and he asks whether having free and fair elections in Belarus would inherently mean that Mr. Lukashenko would not be able to participate in them. So that's a question that he poses. And perhaps I'll turn now to Svetlana to comment on that question, as well as to any of the previous discussions that we've had and comments that have been made. So over to you, Svetlana. Пожалуйста.
Большое спасибо, коллеги и друзья. И я бы хотела особенно отреагировать на несколько ключевых моментов из замечаний, прозвучавших на этой панели. Госпожа Клара Добрев подчеркнула, что нужно особенно внимательно относиться к развитию демократических институтов. И я полностью с этим согласна. Я уверена, что гораздо важнее сделать так, чтобы выборы были прозрачными и демократическими, чем то, кто именно их выиграет. И, во-вторых, я согласна, что построение демократических институтов займет время. Но этому движению вперед нужно придать импульс. И таким импульсами должны стать новые и демократические выборы. Госпожа Остриан, я согласна с вами, что доклад профессора Бенедека, подготовленный в рамках московского механизма ОБСЕ, должен играть большую роль. Кстати, как и вся организация ОБСЕ, и мы благодарны вам и вашим коллегам за поддержку демократических идеалов и борьбы народа Беларуси за честные и достойные выборы. Господин Мантелло, спасибо, что подчеркнули еще раз, и мы хорошо это знаем, что парламентская ассамблея ОБСЕ – друзья Беларуси. И спасибо за вашу бескомпромиссную позицию. Мы на самом деле это очень-очень ценим. И я думаю, что мы полностью согласны в самом важном, что только через диалог мы сможем найти решение теперешнего кризиса. И я уверена, что парламентская ассамблея ОБСЕ может играть очень-очень важную роль в этом диалоге. Господин Каз Замора, и с вами тоже я, конечно, согласна, и вообще мне кажется, что это дискуссия единомышленников сегодня. Вы правы, что уважение основных прав и свобод должно служить основой для демократических выборов. Свободы слова, собраний и ассоциаций должны стать фундаментом для честных выборов, а для этого нужна политическая воля. И такой воли мы, к сожалению, не наблюдаем уже давно. И теперешний кризис, он назревал не только потому, что и в прошлом были нечестные выборы, а он назревал потому, что терпение тех, чьи права ущемляются, это терпение тоже заканчивалось. И также хочу ответить на вопрос от участников. Я думаю, что завтра мы услышим больше деталей относительно того, какие могут быть основные вызовы при проведении честных выборов. Но одно я могу сказать уже сегодня, это не будет просто. но в Беларуси достаточно экспертов мирового уровня и честных, квалифицированных людей, чтобы эти проблемы решить. А относительно того, сможет ли Лукашенко принимать участие в будущих выборах, мой ответ очень простой. Я это уже говорила, что мы должны и будем следовать букве закона при проведении новых выборов.
Thank you very much, Svetlana, for that thoughtful answer and also responding to the other comments that have been made. And as you point out, many of these questions will be dived into deeper in the remaining sessions today and also tomorrow. So I very much encourage participants to stay on and to participate in those more detailed discussions. We have time for a few more questions. The next one is from a student who is studying politics and international relations in England. And she would like to know, what part do students in Belarus and surrounding areas have to play in creating a new and democratic constitution and democratic society? And how can it be ensured that this climate of fear is changed in favor of a more European style of democratic society in Belarus? So I don't know who would like to take the first stab at that question, but a very important one about the role of youth and young people in promoting democratic norms within societies. Maybe Svetlana, if you would like to.
Все же понимают, что студенты — это будущее Беларуси, и роль студентов после выборов, она была, конечно, очевидна. Столько молодежи вышло на улицы городов, чтобы отстоять свой голос, и в университетах и других учебных заведениях студенты демонстрировали свою волю, за что многие из них были отчислены. И те студенты, которые вынуждены были уехать, я больше чем уверена, что, как говорится, в гостях хорошо, дома лучше, все равно хотели бы вернуться, чтобы вместе строить новую Беларусь, чтобы быть полезным своей стране. И призываю всех студентов: учитесь, хорошо учитесь, чтобы потом весь свой опыт и знания использовать на благо нашей любимой Беларуси. Вот. И второй вопрос, Беата.
Yes, sorry about that. The second was, how can the climate of fear that's currently existing be changed out in favor of a more European style of participation?
Мы сейчас говорим о страхе внутри Беларуси, правильно я понимаю?
That's correct.
Вы знаете, что людям страшно, очень страшно, но еще больше всеобъемлющее чувство, которое объединяет белорусов сейчас, не только страх, потому что он не объединяет, а гнев. Гнев, который перерастает в ту энергию, гнев от того, что как обращаются с твоим народом, как обращаются с невиновными людьми, как вынуждают пытками, насилием заканчивать жизнь людей самоубийствами. Это, конечно, кошмар и ужас. И вот этот гнев сейчас перерастает в энергию, которая заставит людей бороться, продолжать бороться за новые выборы, за демократическое будущее. Но, вы знаете, я уверена, что, пройдя все те испытания, которые сейчас выпали на волю белорусов из-за этого жестокого режима, очень быстро позволит белорусам перевести вот эту энергию в демократическое русло, и уже демократический подход к ситуации, к стране, да, они очень очень быстро, ой, боже мой, да, извините, я встала, да, в 4 утра, очень быстро люди перейдут к демократическим принципам при построении новой Беларуси и взаимоотношений. Спасибо.
Thank you very much. And I think it's particularly important to channel those forces in a constructive direction. And as you say, harness the energy that this kind of process brings to allow people, and especially young people, to be able to engage in their societies and engage in their processes rather than become distant from them or in some way not feel that this is part of their solution. We have 5 minutes remaining in this panel, so I thought it would be good for each of the panelists to maybe make a few last comments or any points that they would like to highlight. And perhaps we could go in reverse order, starting with Kevin on his final thoughts for this panel. Please, over to you.
Thank you so much, Beata. I'll simply say that we stand solidly shoulder to shoulder with the pro-democracy forces in Belarus. I think it's their struggle is the relevance of their struggle goes well beyond Belarus. It's a struggle that is important for democratic forces around the world. You're fighting the good fight at a moment where, you know, when many people are skeptical about the future of democracy. So your struggle has a broader meaning to the world, and we are here to support it, and to support it also with in many different ways, including providing the technical assistance necessary to organize credible elections, which inevitably should be part of a new democratic dawn for Belarus. So by all means, count us in, and we are here to be part of this struggle. So I'm very proud that we are having this discussion and to be able to convene this conversation at this critical time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. The importance of democracy globally. Over to you, Roberto.
Thank you very much, Beata. One of the first acts as Secretary General when I was elected in 2016 was to speak to Viktor Gumiński, who is now the Deputy Secretary General of the CIS. He was at that time the head of the Belarus delegation. And I asked him to organize the annual session in Belarus. He came back to me after 1 week, said, of course, we will be ready to organize an annual session in 2017. It was very difficult for me as a newly elected Secretary General to also explain to the rest of the OSCE participating states why we would go to Belarus. There were challenges in Belarus. There were reports from the OSCE, their missions, that things were not going too well. So they say, why do you go there and do this? And we spoke at length with the authorities in Minsk and said, look, we would like to do an annual session. It's a sign of respect and recognition to your authorities and to your country, but we would like you to engage in civil society. They let a big forum for civil society NGOs meet the day before the annual session met. That there was a great speech, in my opinion, of President Lukashenko at our opening plenary, and I will circulate this speech later on. We would hope at that time that this was the beginning of an ouverture, let's say, of Belarus authorities towards the things that the OSCE stands for. I must say, unfortunately, the situation as it is now is very far from what it was in 2017. So my concluding remarks would be to appeal to all of those who were our partners in the lead up to the annual session, with whom we engaged, and we created also personal rapport, to say to them, please go back to where we were, try to engage your opposition, try to talk to your people, try to open up the doors. There are no enemies here. There is nobody who has any prejudice. There are just people who stand for values, the values of this organization. But we would like you to open up the doors and engage the OSCE. And we would like to ask you to engage the representatives of your civil society, the representatives of your political parties, those who have competed in the presidential elections like Svetlana, and all those who represent other segments of the Belarusian society other than the presidential administration. So that's my message. Open the door and talk to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Roberto. Over to you, Ms. Austrian, for your final thoughts.
Thank you so much. I'd like to continue with what I started with, which is the United States stands with the Belarusian people in their aspirations for a democratic and a prosperous future. And we support the call of the people for the regime to respect human rights and fundamental freedoms. And this is support for media freedom. This is support for freedom of assembly. And this is support for freedom of speech and for self-determination. And so the United States is looking at all of the tools that we have available to support the Belarusian people's democratic aspirations. And I did see a question that was lower in the chat that referred to sanctions. And I think if you look from the White House just last week, the White House announced that the U.S. Treasury Department is going to be developing a new executive order that will provide the United States the ability to impose additional sanctions on the Lukashenko regime and its support network and those that support the corruption and the abuse of human rights and the attacks on democracy. So this is not a struggle that has come to an end, and we stand with the Belarusian people.
Thank you very much for that, Courtney. And Ms. Clara Dobrev is, while we're discussing elections on the campaign trail, so had to drop off, but I'm sure that she will follow this discussion. And so the final word to Ms. Tikhanovskaya on any last thoughts that she would like to convey.
Спасибо всем большое, кто сегодня присутствовал на этой конференции. Для нас, для белорусов, это очень-очень важно. Особая благодарность Александру Шлыку, моему специальному представителю по выборам, за организацию конференции, и Беате за модерацию. Огромное спасибо всем участникам и экспертам, что уделили время для обсуждения новых выборов в Беларуси. И я надеюсь, что завтра будет не менее продуктивная дискуссия. И такого рода дискуссии, конференции – это начало к честным выборам в Беларуси. Я в этом уверена, и вы отдали сегодня частичку себя, чтобы у нас это скорее получилось. Всем спасибо большое. До свидания.
Thank you very much, Svetlana. Thank you very much to all the panelists and to all of those who have joined in today. Спасибо вам всем огромное. And the discussions will continue now on to the second panel and tomorrow in the second day on various short-term and long-term possible solutions to electoral reform and continued dialogue. So with that, I close and I hand over back to Alexander Schlick. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Beata. Thank you for the wonderful moderation. Большое спасибо, Beata, за идеальное проведение этой панели высокого уровня. Мы продолжаем. Мы без промедления переходим к политической панели. Я рад предоставить слово господину Майклу Мейеру Резенде, который будет модератором в этой панели. И я вижу, что все наши панелисты уже присоединились, поэтому без задержки мы переходим к политической панели. Большое спасибо. С нами сейчас около 80 зрителей, и за нашей прямой трансляцией на YouTube на пике смотрели несколько сотен человек. Напоминаю всем, что трансляция этой конференции будет, ее записи будут предоставлены на YouTube и позже тоже. С этим, пожалуйста, Майкл, передаю вам слово.
Thank you very much, Alexander, for the handover. I hope you can all hear me well. I wish you a good afternoon in Minsk, in Warsaw, Berlin, or wherever you're watching from, and a good morning for those who are in the United States. It's my honor to speak here. I'm very glad that we can be part of this event by the Coordination Council, by the team of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, to explore some of these more institutional questions in more detail. I will do as Beata did before and introduce the speakers here before I hand the floor to them. Before doing that, just maybe a few thoughts from my side. My name is Michael Meyer-Resende. I represent Democracy Reporting International. It's an NGO based in Berlin. We have offices in many countries. We have an office in Ukraine, for example, and worked for many years also in all parts of the OSCE inside the EU as well. And I was encouraged by what Klara Dobrev said about institutions, because that very much represents our idea or the focus of our organization in terms of supporting democracy, which is strengthening of institutions. There is an interesting connection, I think, between social mobilization and the creation of institutions. And I would quote the founder of the European Union, one of the founders, Jean Monnet, who said that change is made by people, but change is maintained by institutions. And I think this is very important in all discussion of democratization, that you have a moment of mobilization. At some point, it has to translate into institutions to be durable and to stick. And that's what we try to work on. And with this in mind, we have in the last month held various meetings with partners, in particular with the European Partnership for Democratic Elections, to look at various institutional aspects of the situation in Belarus, be it constitutional reforms or elections, together with many good experts from Belarus. I would share three thoughts for this panel now. I think the one question one has to answer head on is, why are we doing this? Where is the opening for elections? Many people don't see it now, and I can understand that sentiment. I've worked for more than 20 years in political transitions, and they are very unpredictable. There are often situations where you think it's totally hopeless and suddenly something changes. And I think that's a one point to keep in mind. And I think it's extremely important to have a very good level of preparedness. And I know many of the people in the panel today work tirelessly to be prepared for a moment where the voice of Belarusians is heard again, and to prepare that moment and not to be wrong-footed, if you want. So that's, I think, one merit of the discussion we have today. Second merit is actually the person who is not in the call. There was an invitation to representatives of the Belarusian government, where I'm not too surprised that they didn't accept, but I think it's very important to signal that, of course, these events and these exchanges are nothing secret. They're not behind closed doors. They're there for everybody. And there may be many people actually working in the administration of Belarus who don't dare, are not allowed simply to attend here, but they may listen. And I think it's important to keep in mind that there may be many people who would love to work for that kind of transition, but they don't have the possibility to do so now. And the third observation is that we speak a lot about fear and anger, and I fully understand this, and I share that if we look at the developments in Belarus, in particular, since August last year. But I think what you do, the people who are here on the panel, shows us something different also. It's the opposite of fear, it's confidence. The Coordination Council sits here confidently with many international interlocutors, discusses the ideas, discusses them in transparency, and has a dialogue about them. And we see time and again that in dictatorships and very closed regimes, there's no such courage. There's no open debate, there's no discussion, there's just hiding and lying and pretending. And I think in this way also this panel should show us a good Belarus, a confident Belarus with very good expertise that gets out there and discusses ideas and what it's doing. And that's what we all do in Europe. All our governments are in discussions, international discussions, explaining and listening to what others have to say. And with these introductory remarks, I would turn to the first speaker, and I hope we can manage this panel well with the 3 languages. I hope I'm not speaking too fast for the translators. And I would start by asking all of you to tell us in 5 minutes, where do you see the situation now? Yeah, it's different than 3 months ago and different than 6 months ago. And what would it mean for elections where we are now? How do we get from what was discussed in the previous panel deeper into what does all this mean now for a possible electoral process? And that would be the introduction, and then we go deeper into these questions. And I would first invite, following the agenda here, Franak Kaverkova. I think he is known to many of you. He is an activist, he is a journalist, he worked for Belsat TV and for Radio Free Europe, and he's a senior advisor to Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, and has, I think, gained a lot of visibility in this role and helped a lot to explain developments in Belarus in the last 12 months. And so, Franak, I give you the floor to explain us where do you see things standing and what would that mean? Where do we are in relation to possible elections? You have the floor.
Thank you so much, and thank you for organizing this conference. Congratulations to Alex Schlick and also to my colleagues on this panel. I must say that we are now in the beginning of the third wave of Belarus uprising or revolution. So everything started before presidential elections last year, when 3 leading forces united and 3 female politicians took a picture, actually, and many things started with this picture because it was demonstration of the unity of democratic forces, but also of the willingness of the society to change the paradigm. The second wave was after elections, when elections were rigged, and elections became the critical point in this uprising, because people clearly demonstrated that the elections, that they want changes. They voted for Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. They managed to prove they voted for Svetlana Tikhanovskaya because of many technologies that that helped to show the contrast between those supporting the regime and those supporting the democratic movement. I was just, I received from Alex Schlick the message that I can speak Belarusian language. Я могу говорить по-белорусски? Подтвердите, коли ласка.
Yes, we have translation. You can speak in any of the 3 languages.
Добре, тоді я перейду на беларускую. Значыць, у 9 жніўня беларусы паказалі, што большасць за перамены. Гэта праяўлялася праз праграму «Голас», праз асобныя цэнтры фіксацыі фальсіфікацыяў, такія як Зубар Медыя і іншыя. І яны выйшлі на вуліцу ў абарону сваіх галасоў. Пасля гэта трошкі тэма пратэстаў пашырылася. Акрамя ўласна выбараў, людзі пачалі пратэставаць за годнасць, бо першыя пратэсты сутыкнуліся з гвалтам, з катаваннямі, з рэпрэсіямі з боку рэжыму. І трэцяя хваля, цяпер, калі гэтыя пратэсты ўжо былі задушаныя крывавым рэжымам, яны зараз набываюць новую форму мірнага падполля. Але беларусы ўжо саспелі да думкі, што толькі выбары, новыя выбары могуць вырашыць крызіс, які быў утвораны папярэднімі 2 хвалямі. На жаль, дарога да новых выбараў, яна немагчымая без вулічнага супрацьстаяння, яна немагчымая без будавання новых альтэрнатыўных структураў, якія і лягуць у аснову новага дэмакратычнага грамадства, і яны немагчымыя без міжнароднай супольнасці. Так ці інакш, міжнародны ўдзел неабходны у выглядзе дапамогі падчас транзітнага перыяду, у выглядзе арганізацыі часовых інстытутаў улады для правядзення выбараў і для непасрэдна назірання за самімі выбарамі, каб гэтыя вынікі выбараў былі справядлівыя і прызнаныя ўсімі бакамі. Мы зараз бачым рэжым, які прызнаецца ўскосна ва ўсіх сваіх злачынствах, спынення самалёта, рэпрэсіі супраць актывістаў, гэта ускосныя прыкметы няўпэўненасці рэжыму. Але з іншага боку мы таксама працягваем руку дапамогі. Мы кажам, што людзі, якія па той бок стаяць, вы таксама беларусы, давайте разам з вами вырашым крызіс. І гэты крызіс вырашыць можна толькі пры дапамозе новых выбараў, да якіх мы прыйдзем праз перамовы. Вельмі важна, правільна тут не блытаць. З аднаго боку гэта прымірэнне, пра якое ўжо гаварылася, а з іншага боку справядлівасць і законнасць. Все вінаватыя павінны быць прыцягнутыя да адказнасці, несумненна. Все, хто здзяйснялі злачынствы, павінны несці пакаранне. Але з іншага боку нам трэба зрабіць так, каб выбары яны не раскалолі грамадства яшчэ больш, а каб яны аб'ядналі грамадства, расколатае рэжымам і гэтым крызісам, які ўтварыўся ў выніку мінулых выбараў. Таму што, па сутнасці, у нас ёсць крызіс легітымнасці, нават вакуум легітымнасці. Асоба, якая мае легітымнасць, яна не знаходзіцца ў Беларусі, а ўлада, якая захапіла кантроль над сілавікамі, яна не мае легітымнасці і не мае падтрымкі большасці народу. Каб яго вырашыць, нам трэба, каб адзін з бакоў меў магчымасць гэтую легітымнасць вярнуць сабе, узнавіць, а гэта магчыма зноў жа пры дапамозе выбараў, якія будуць прызнаныя як беларускім грамадствам, так і міжнароднай супольнасцю. Я спынюся на гэтым месцы. Я яшчэ раз пацверджу, што я упэўнены, што выбары магчымыя. Я упэўнены, што выбары магчымыя ў гэтым годзе. Нашы эксперты і Алекс Шлык распрацавалі, што это магчыма зрабіць за 1,5 месяца у тэорыі, але гэта магчыма зрабіць пры умове, што ўсе бакі зацікаўленыя у тым, каб гэтыя выбары адбыліся.
Thank you very much. I was just hesitating to listen to the end of the translation. That will happen occasionally, so don't think I lost you or something. Thank you very much, Frana Kaverkova, also for sticking to the time and to referring to the important groundwork that has been done by Alexander Schlick and his colleagues, and which we will discuss in more detail tomorrow. I'm now happy to invite the next panelist, Olga Kaverkova. She is a trained lawyer. She is an activist. She is a member of the board of the Christian Democrats. She had been detained already last year and had to leave the country, like all of you, as far as I'm aware. And she's also in the presidium of the Coordination Council. So, Olga, you have the floor. Please let us know, also in 5 minutes or so, your thoughts about the current situation and how it could evolve towards elections.
Добрый день всем. Спасибо за организацию, спасибо моим коллегам, которые принимают участие в дискуссии.
Важно сказать о том, что... Меня слышно? Важно сказать, что после разгромных выборов для Александра Лукашенко основными требованиями белорусского общества продолжают оставаться прекращение репрессий, освобождение политических, новые выборы. Но если мы посмотрим на сегодня уже 9 месяцев с августа, мы, к сожалению, не достигли результата по этим 3 направлениям. Здесь важно сказать, что Беларусь продолжает требовать участия в управлении страной, и выборы – это инструмент этого участия. 26 лет мы не выбираем власть, и можно сделать вывод, в какой сегодня ситуации, в каком находится белорусское общество. Когда люди не выбирают своих представителей в органы власти, то происходит сильный разрыв, потому что это делает назначенная власть, то, что делает назначенная власть, не соответствует тому, что хотят и нужно людям. Все эти процессы ведут к расколу в обществе, делают его неустойчивым и слабым и нарушают работу системы. Фактически действующий режим сегодня уничтожает белорусскую государственность, и помочь в ее защите сегодня могут только и в первую очередь и государственные служащие и чиновники. Текущая ситуация угрожает всей стране, потому что выплачивать те огромные кредиты по тем внутренним и внешним долгам, которые есть в Беларуси, будут не только граждане
граждане демократических взглядов, но и все белорусы, и ответственность в первую очередь на тех, кто находится сегодня внутри системы и имеет возможности влиять на нее. Именно государственные служащие могут и должны своей силой поучаствовать в давлении и принуждении режима к разрешению кризиса, потому что диалог – это не прекращение репрессий, это прекращение репрессий, это отмена противоконституционных законов. И это не слабость, это проявление силы для сохранения и развития страны. Но сегодня я хотела бы сделать еще акцент на одной важной, на мой взгляд, теме, потому что на календаре июня 2021 года и в существующих сегодня в Беларуси условиях новые выборы, на мой взгляд, недостижимая цель. Потому что первое необходимое условие для их реализации – это жесткая позиция Европейского Союза и США в отношении России, потому что сегодняшний режим держится исключительно на поддержке Владимира Путина, и в этих условиях фактической вседозволенности и гарантированных кредитов на поддержание власти со стороны Кремля власть не пойдет на проведение новых выборов, поскольку она гарантированно их проиграет. Любые санкции Европейского Союза экономически имеют ограниченное действие, поскольку белорусские власти могут компенсировать действие санкций поддержкой России и перенаправлением грузов в другие страны через Российскую Федерацию. Таким образом, международным условием должна быть нейтрализация влияния России в Беларуси. И это могут сделать ЕС и США. То, что Байден будет говорить с Путиным о Беларуси, это абсолютно правильно. Но только в том случае, если не будет ставить под вопрос независимость Беларуси, и если разговор будет жестким. Можно сказать, что Беларусь – это всего лишь иллюстрация бессилия западной демократии перед тоталитарными и авторитарными режимами по всему миру. Это вызов, и глобальные подходы необходимо пересматривать. Белорусский режим действует так жестко, потому что он знал мягкую позицию, ему прощали абсолютно все. Давайте вспомним судей, которые раньше попадали в санкционные списки, потом спокойно выходили из этих списков. Сегодня эти судьи дают активистам 30 суток и года заключения за политическую позицию. И они чувствуют, что они останутся безнаказанными. Я убеждена в том, что авторитаризм по всему миру чувствует себя достаточно свободно. И здесь не только Беларусь. Миллионы уйгуров в Китае находятся в концентрационных лагерях. Это никак не мешает делать бизнес с китайскими компаниями. Россия устроила войну в Грузии, но, как ни в чем не бывало, Обама жал кнопку перезагрузки. Потом случился Донбасс, случился Крым. Нужно понять, что подходы Европейского Союза и демократических стран должны быть радикально пересмотрены к авторитарному режиму, потому что авторитаризм наступает не только в Беларуси. И если к вопросу борьбы с нарушением прав человека и противодействия авторитаризма в Беларуси подходить не в отрыве от вот этого всего международного контекста, то тогда есть шанс, что попытки построения демократии будут успешными. И как раз нужно понять, что борьба за демократию – это очень серьезный глобальный вопрос, который сегодня стоит в принципе перед человечеством и перед демократиями во всем мире. И вот новые честные выборы должны пройти после того, как будут остановлены репрессии, освобождены политические заключенные, будет возможность вернуться в страну политическим лидерам, которые находятся в вынужденной миграции. И также обязательным условием является присутствие миссии ОБСЕ. И сегодня очень важно для Беларуси расследование политических преступлений по белорусским и международным законам. Спасибо.
Thank you, Olga, for also looking a little bit at the bigger international and, if you want, geostrategic context, which we all know plays a big role also in this whole crisis. I would then turn to Pavel Latushka. Pavel Latushka is a graduate of the law faculty, and he's a former Belarusian diplomat. You have been ambassador to Poland, to France, to Spain and Portugal. You have also served as a Minister of Culture, and in your last official position, I understand, as a director of the National Academic Theatre, then you were forced to resign from there. And you're also a member of the Presidium of the Coordination Council and also the head of the National Anti-Crisis Management. And we are very interested also, of course, in your views and thoughts on where we are now and how we could get to elections from here, or what kind of scenarios could unfold that would open that door. Ms. Filatushka, I give you the floor.
Добрый день, уважаемые участники конференции. Прежде всего, разрешите поблагодарить Светлану Тихановскую, офис лидера, за организацию данного мероприятия, Александра Шлыка, который является опытным специалистом, профессионалом, экспертом в избирательной тематике. Говорить сегодня о будущих выборах достаточно сложно. Почему? Но необходимо. Почему? Потому что сегодняшние события, связанные с очередной попыткой суицида, которую совершил гражданин Беларуси Степан Латыпов в зале суда, когда ему должен был быть вынесен уголовный приговор, показывает ужас той ситуации, которая складывается в нашей стране. Говорить о выборах как о позитивной будущей перспективе выхода из той сложной ситуации в Беларуси необходимо, но прежде всего, мне кажется, я поддерживаю здесь Ольгу Кавалькову, необходимо сосредоточиться на том, как прийти именно к этому этапу выборов. Вновь в повестке дня стоит вопрос, он никогда и не снимался, какие методы и способы достижения нашей цели, начала строительства новой демократической Беларуси, необходимо применить. Я говорю в данном случае с позиции Народного антикризисного управления, которое я возглавляю, офис которого находится в Варшаве. Мы исходим из необходимости масштабного давления на режим и максимальной мобилизации всего белорусского общества, как проживающего в Беларуси, так и среди большой иммиграции, которая сложилась за рубежом. Если мы ставим это как главный подход, то дальше мы должны осуществлять следующие действия. Прежде всего, давление внутри страны, и мы должны говорить о максимальной мобилизации всего актива в Беларуси, и этому посвящен тот план, который вчера был представлен институционно-аналитическим центром «Байпол», план мобилизации общества, который предполагает формирование структур непубличных, однако мирных, я еще раз хотел бы подчеркнуть, вне зависимости от профессий, специальности, занимаемых должностей, социальных групп, формирование актива, который в решающий момент будет задействован для того, чтобы показать массовый народный протест, несогласие с тем режимом узурпатора, который сегодня совершает преступления в центре Европы. Следующий элемент – это санкции. К сожалению, я должен констатировать полное разочарование в политике Европейского Союза за последние 9 месяцев. Несмотря на то, что мы неоднократно говорили, ежедневно общаясь с политиками, представителями внешнеполитических ведомств, депутатами парламентов, другими влиятельными силами в различных странах мира, я говорю здесь от имени Народного антикризисного управления, от своего имени, убеждая их в том, что режим не пойдет на попятную, и только эффективные, жесткие, принципиальные санкции могут остановить волну самых масштабных за последние 40 лет в Европе репрессий, нас не услышали европейские политики. И нужно было дождаться инцидента с самолетом ирландской авиакомпании Ryanair для того, чтобы сделать очередное заявление. У меня есть опасения, что за этим политическим заявлением, которое было сделано на прошлой неделе руководителями европейских стран, прежде всего ведущих стран, таких как Германия, Франция, ну и практически всеми, не последуют вновь реальные действия. Это, к сожалению, на такую мысль меня приводит опыт общения с европейскими политиками последние 9 лет. Аргументы, которые используются, не выдерживают критики. Первое, что санкции нанесут ущерб белорусам. Второе, что это втолкнет нас в объятия России. Ну, отвечая на второй вопрос, значит, вы просто будете наблюдателями, observers, того, как за 2-3 года Беларусь станет частью России. Или вы с этим соглашаетесь сегодня и ничего не делаете, тогда и нет необходимости вводить санкции. Второй аргумент, второй тезис, это связанный с влиянием на белорусское общество. Белорусы готовы терпеть санкции в течение месяцев, но не готовы жить годы, многие годы под властью диктатора, который убивает, насилует, издевается над белорусами. Все это приведет к еще большей масштабной миграции с территории Беларуси. То, что совершен этот инцидент с самолетом, показывает, что режим готов идти на акты международного терроризма. То, что в обиход уже вводится тема атомной электростанции в Островце в Беларуси, это угроза уже ядерного характера, и Лукашенко будет использовать это все как в декларациях, так и в реальных действиях. Наконец-то необходимо отрезветь европейским политикам и принять в это во внимание. Следующий элемент правового давления. Для этого необходимо не только желание адвокатов, но и политическая воля стран, где может осуществляться правовое преследование режима, сторонников режима. Я говорю о Конвенции ООН противодействию пыткам, так называемой универсальной юрисдикции. Пока этому примеру идут только две страны, реально Германия и Литва. Другие страны уходят от этой тематики и не принимают политических решений, чтобы открыть и правовые способы преследования преступников. Следующий процесс – это Международный суд в Гааге. Мы подали соответствующее обращение и, конечно, настаиваем на том, чтобы был создан прецедент международного уголовного преследования сторонников режима, тех, кто виновен в преступлениях. Ну и следующий правовой инструмент давления – это возбуждение уголовных дел по факту захвата самолета Ryanair в Литве, Латвии, Польше, в Ирландии. Надеюсь, что Ирландия тоже пойдет этим путем. Поэтому это на сегодняшний день главное. Я тоже соглашусь с Ольгой Ковальковой. Как раз-таки неоднократно говорил это европейским политикам, они этого не слышали. Первое, что необходимо было бы сделать, это вернуть в санкционные списки всех тех лиц, которые находились в санкционных списках за последние 20 лет. Безнаказанность этих лиц демонстрирует, что даже сейчас, если они попадут вновь в списки, через какое-то время они будут из них исключены. Основанием этому является следующее. Между режимом и Европейским Союзом было достигнуто не письменное, но дипломатическое, политическое согласие. Освобождение политзаключенных и отмена списков. Это произошло. Сейчас режим нарушил это дипломатическое соглашение. Он вновь посадил еще большем количестве политических заключенных в тюрьмы, и это дает полное право Европейскому Союзу автоматически, не рассматривая дополнительно, вернуть всех тех, кто находился в санкционных списках, вновь под ограничение въезда на территорию Беларуси. Экономические санкции. Мы говорим о том, что они должны быть реально существенными, эффективными и сильными. Только тогда они будут краткосрочными. Говорить о том, что санкции не дают эффекта, это блеф, потому что их просто нет. Никто не попробовал их применить. Если это будут секторальные санкции в отношении нефтехимического комплекса, энергетического, финансового комплекса, только тогда это будет реальный эффект на режим, и это позволит нам мобилизовать людей для того, чтобы они смогли победить в этой ужасной, очень сложной, но так важной не только для белорусского и европейского народа, но и для всей Европы борьбе. Ну а следующий этап, понятно, выборы. Выборы президента страны по старой конституции, это мой подход, и принятие новой конституции и уже переход к парламентско-президентской республике. Если мы пойдем другим путем, сначала будем проводить реформу Конституции, мы можем получить ситуацию реванша в Беларуси, когда нелегитимный парламент попытается отыграть ситуацию не в пользу демократических сил. Я думаю, что юристы понимают, о чем я говорю. Еще раз благодарю участников и организаторов этой конференции.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lakushka for these reflections. I think what you said at the end about the sequences, that is something we should discuss here more. That's very interesting. Before we do so, I come to last but not least, Ambassador Ursula Gacek. Ursula Gacek is previously, I understand, a financial analyst, and then she moved into politics. She became a member of the Polish Senate and then also of the European Parliament for the Polish Civic Platform Party. And as you know, many Polish people are supporting the cause of Belarus and the cause of democratization in Eastern Europe. And she is one of them, and has also served in diplomatic capacity as the Polish permanent representative to the Council of Europe, also as the Consul General to New York for Poland. And she has headed OSCD, ODIHR election observation missions in various countries. So she has been quite involved with the ins and outs of democratic election, also in countries where there were lots of challenges towards them. And Ambassador, I look forward to hear from you your thoughts on the situation now in Belarus and the option of elections. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak on what is no easy subject. There is no simple recipe. There is no easy how-to guide for the pro-democracy forces in Belarus when it comes to conducting and winning, hopefully, democratic elections as a means of removing the current regime. Nevertheless, the task ahead is to prepare for them. The recent history of the past 3 decades in this part of Europe, I'm speaking to you this afternoon from Poland, has numerous examples of attempts to end autocratic regimes via elections, many ending in success, but some, especially in the former Soviet republics, in failure. Identifying the factors that played the key role in determining the outcome has proven to be extremely difficult. Back in 2010, a little old now, but nevertheless an excellent comparative study by Bumson Volchik is a brilliant analysis of just how difficult it is to pin down the variables that actually make the success. Even if we do manage to succeed in identifying some of these factors, many of them will be external in nature. When I use the word external, don't confuse that with international. By external, I mean those which are outside the control and outside the influence of today's opposition forces. Those are the factors that will require that the current regime sits down and negotiates, relinquishes at least some of the unfair advantage it has over the opposition. And so a lot has been said on the external factors, but today in my 5 minutes, I would like to focus on 3 areas in which I believe the opposition does have the ability to change something. It does have influence on attainable and hopefully workable goals. Elections will come around in Belarus, be they local, parliamentary, or of course the all-important and key presidential ones. And while waiting for them, what can the opposition do? Do they just sit it out, wait for the regime to collapse under the strain of economic sanctions or not? We've heard that with the support of Moscow, those sanctions may not be as painful as the EU hoped, or under the weight of its own corruption. Are the protests that we see, although unprecedented in length and scope, enough to focus on for now? Sooner or later, that window of election opportunity will open, and hopefully sooner as the severity of repressions, the greater willingness to flout international law as shown by the diversion of an international flight, as well as willingness to flout domestic law, can be viewed rather as symptomatic of a weakening regime rather than a strengthening one. So what can the opposition forces do realistically, bearing in mind all the constraints, the lack of the playing field? The suggestions I make are not an alternative to negotiations for change. They're not an alternative to working towards a new electoral code, a new electoral administration, but they are immediate actions I hope that we will be able to discuss. So the first one is to prepare to cooperate as opposition. In the past, it's been far too easy to blame opposition, not only in Belarus, but in other countries hoping to move towards transition, to blame them for their election failure because of an ability to unite. I intentionally use the word cooperate rather than the word unite, because the task of winning an election in such a situation is far, far more complex. If it was just as simple as uniting the opposition, we would probably have solved this problem a decade ago. And also because I'm a former politician and I'm realistic and I know about the internal dynamics of politics. But there will be elections in which uniting forces around one opposition candidate will be expedient. Most likely this will be the presidential election. But unity may not be essential in what may well come sooner unless the election calendar shifts dramatically, and that will be elections at a local or parliamentary level. But cooperation is still very important. I think the thing to keep in mind is who is the real enemy here and who is just your competitor. And so the regime will play on every fear of a disoriented electorate, suggesting destabilization, ramping up fears of destabilization, and paradoxically, even in an economic downturn stemming from sanctions can play into the hands of the regime. The voter will be looking for an alternative, and they should not see an opposition sniping at each other. They might have different visions of the future, but on the fundamentals, I hope that there will be cooperation and a common vision. The second thing that I would suggest is important to prepare for is to prepare to campaign. I have no doubt whatsoever that today's leaders of the pro-democratic forces in Belarus are passionate, courageous, and fiercely dedicated to their cause. However, 27 years of an increasingly autocratic regime has robbed them of an opportunity to simply be politicians in a normal functioning democracy, to gain experience of a normal campaign, which is the first hurdle they will face. A tightly controlled propaganda machine robs them of access to real opinion polls and hence of knowledge to what the Belarusian people actually want. A system of corrupt patronage on one side and repression and intimidation on the other has robbed them of natural constituencies of potential voters. This is all compounded by voters' perception that nothing can change, that elections are invariably rigged. Against this backdrop, putting together a positive and credible alternative in line with the real hopes and expectations of the disillusioned and disheartened electorate is as important as it is difficult. There may be discussions on whether, for example, to boycott some of the less important elections, maybe the local elections. From my own political, diplomatic, and election observation experience, I would say use every chance you get to promote your cause, to promote your leaders, to promote your platform and your vision. I rarely have seen boycotting bringing about the desired effect. And secondly, as politicians, be prepared to answer the question. So once you've toppled this regime, what then? Remember, the regime will paint the opposition forces as destructive destabilizers. They must have an idea of what the average voter wants, what he or she stands to gain under a new democratic administration they hope to be part of. And they must be able to convey this message to the electorate, despite the limitations on freedom of expression. And finally, prepare to verify and monitor elections. Maybe things will be great, and maybe events will take such a turn that the next election is conducted within a legal framework and with an election administration that gives confidence in the process. That unlike 2020, international election observers from the OSCE's Office for Democratic and Institutional and Human Rights will again be admitted to Belarus. but whilst hoping for the best, prepare for a situation where the system is still far from perfect, or that the trust in the process will not have been rebuilt despite reforms. Opposition can work with civil society to provide opinion polls, exit polls, domestic observation, and parallel tabulation. Working on such projects has an additional advantage. It will cement civil society and opposition relationships. It builds trust, it builds support networks, it gives access to expertise and to funding. Autocratic regimes are always very fearful of close cooperation between opposition and civil society. I hope that in this brief introduction, I've introduced some realistic, attainable, and immediate actions that can be taken by the democratic opposition. Actions that will be, of course, part of a much wider range of activities undertaken not only by them, but also by the international community and those that will be discussed in the panels, the technical panels that follow on from this one. Steps that can be taken so that when that window of opportunity opens for the opposition, they will be in the very best place they can be to seize that moment and to seize that opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for the fine-grained view on this situation. It makes a lot of sense to me. I think if I look at various transitions, when they happen, they can have very different shapes. Sometimes you have a complete collapse of a regime, which in a way makes rebuilding easier. It can be difficult because there's a huge vacuum, but there tends to be less resistance. I've also seen transitions where figures were changed, but the same structures managed the entire transition, and it never became really credible and never really involved people's aspirations. And that's also a risk. And the other one are really negotiated transitions where you don't hold all the cards. And I think that was a bit your directions, and those are difficult and they're far from perfect. And you may not have a level playing field, and yet it may be worth going into it because it's the best opportunity you have. And if it's worth it or not, of course, it's very much a case-by-case questions. But I think thinking along these lines is really important to define in a way what are the minimum conditions under which one would go into such a process. What would one negotiate for? And that's technical issues. I think that would be very interesting to explore here. Some speakers spoke about international sanctions and the positioning of EU and others. I understand that's a big subject now. I would park it a little bit for our discussion today because I think these demands make a lot of sense, but we are not necessarily the group who can do a lot about it. I think we come more from the side of democracy and election expertise, and I think these demands have been made very clearly by many Belarusian players and are well known in many capitals. We have a number of questions here, and I would invite those questioners now. And I would start with Ms. Laima Andrikienė from Lithuania, a member of parliament and also a member of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. You have the floor for a comment or a question.
Thank you very much. Yes, my name is Laima Andrikienė. I'm from the Lithuanian Parliament, and I am also the Vice President of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. First of all, I would like to thank Svetlana Tikhanovskaya and Alex Schlick for organizing this conference. And it's a pleasure to see Ursula Gatzek, my former colleague in the European Parliament. My question is on the need for electoral reform in Belarus, in the country where the crackdown on civil society, journalists and activists continue. As we know, there are more than 400 political prisoners, and this figure is increasing. Lukashenko's plan of so-called constitutional reform indicates that his regime is attempting to delay it as much as possible and preserve the status quo. There are very important positive trends to be taken into consideration. Pro-democracy movement is self-transforming into decentralized self-organization, which makes it more resilient against regime's attempts to control it. We also observe a new way of thinking and generational changes within Belarusian society, the rebirth of Belarusian nation. And democratic forces are seeking, as we know, genuine and democratic elections as soon as possible this year. So today, I understand that we speak about a negotiated solution, or in other words, possibility of snap elections and new and independent Central Election Commission. In this context, some politicians argue that Belarus needs a massive and urgent reform of the electoral law before elections take place. And that was very visible in the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe when we debated a reform exactly about the urgent need for electoral reform in Belarus. My understanding is that there is a hope for good elections if new people are in charge and amend the practice and the application of the rules within the framework of the current law. That is what I believe in. So my question to all Belarusian panelists is, do you think it is doable? Is it a realistic scenario to have independent Central Election Commission and to organize snap elections, rejecting the idea of massive reform of the electoral law, which to my mind is very similar to Lukashenko's idea of the constitutional reform? Do you, dear Belarusian friends, do you feel strong enough to achieve that, to convince your compatriots that these minimal changes will be enough to have democratic elections meeting international standards? Thank you.
Thank you. That strikes me as a very interesting question. Where does real reform begin, even if not complete? Where is it still a facade process? I suggest the following. I have one more question from a participant from abroad, and I will call her in. So we gather this question, and then I go back to the panelists. And I also know that we have a colleague from Belarus, from the Christian Democratic Party, who will give us a comment. But I gather these two international comments here first. And I think the second person we have is Eva Nielsen from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Sweden. Ms. Nielsen, if you are online, you can pose your question here. I don't see you. Doesn't seem to be the case at this point. So we come back to you, and maybe then I give the floor to Vital Rima-Shoyski from the Christian Democrats in Belarus for a question or a quick remark. Vital, are you there? Not lucky with these two at the moment. Well, I think the questions and comments were already very interesting. So I would like to pass to you this question.
Извините, у меня технические были проблемы с доступом. Я могу говорить, да?
Please.
Да, добрый день, спасибо организаторам, и я очень рад принять участие в этой встрече. Извините, я сейчас с дороги, неудобно без видео. Я хотел в качестве дискуссии сделать следующий комментарий. Вы знаете, мы говорим о переговорах, мы говорим о процессе проведения свободных выборов, но, к сожалению, совершенно очевидно, что белорусский режим сегодня эти выборы проиграет, никаким переговорам он не готов. В ответ на переговоры на нас, на предложение переговоров на нас заводят новые уголовные дела. И, в общем-то, даже сама риторика многих сегодня выступающих, мы понимаем, мне кажется, она предполагает инструменты из прошлого, инструменты, которые больше не работают. И мне кажется, вот я поддерживаю тот тезис, который озвучила Ольга Kaverkova, что нужен комплексный подход, нужно пересмотреть весь инструментарий, который есть сегодня у Европейского Союза, а также в Соединенных Штатах в работе с авторитарными режимами. Мне кажется, что сейчас на самом деле не совсем корректно даже ставить вопрос о диалоге. Стоило бы ставить вопрос о переговорах, потому что к диалогу власти не готовы. Переговоры, как известно, ведут с политическими оппонентами или врагами. Они так относятся к Европейскому Союзу, так относятся к демократическим настроенным гражданам внутри страны. Здесь реально людей пытают в тюрьмах, и вы видите, что за те жертвы, которые были во время протестов. Никто не понес ответственности никакой. И невозможно и контрпродуктивно, мне кажется, говорить о вот каких-то вариантах проведения свободных выборов вне общего контекста разговоров с авторитарным режимом внутри Беларуси, ну и, конечно, с Владимиром Путиным и с Кремлем, потому что понятно, что Беларусь не была бы, возможно, черной дырой в плане демократии на карте Европы без, как и, собственно говоря, и Приднестровье, как и Абхазия, как и сейчас Донбасс, все это не были бы черные дыры, если бы не активная позиция Кремля, которую просто, мы не имеем права, просто, я считаю, закрывать на это глаза и не считаться с этим фактором, потому что если Беларусь брать как отдельный кейс там и рассматривать его вне контекста поддержки и политической, и экономической, и готовность была и военной поддержки во время протестов, мы это видели со стороны Кремля, то тогда, наверное, это будет не совсем правильно. Вот мне кажется, что ревизию инструментов Европейского Союза в разговоре с авторитарными режимами нужно провести срочно и пересмотреть, наверное, свои подходы. Это не значит, что нужно отказаться от переговоров, но это значит, что нужно учесть те ошибки, которые были сделаны раньше, и не повторять их. Иначе мы не достигнем успеха. Спасибо.
Thank you, Vital. I can add this, I think, to the question here. And now I see that we may have a chance to hear from Eva Nilsson. Is that so? She's promoted to panelist, I see, so she may show up here. But it doesn't seem to work. Well, I would say, let me go back to the panel here. So I think the questions raised very much highlight a bit this big question mark. Why are we talking about things like negotiations at this point? And I think it's always important to say, as Ambassador Gacek said, it's about scenarios. It's not saying that it's happening this afternoon, but there may be a moment where it's happening. I think, Franak, you said in the beginning, the regime now is devoid of any legitimacy. So there could be a situation when it wants to get back legitimacy and pay a price of a slight opening. This is a typical scenario, and that then brings negotiations. And the question is, what would be the minimum lines? Would that be, is there a clear idea about quick fixes that would be good enough? Or is there the risk, as our Lithuanian colleague said, that this is only a facade action which doesn't bring anything except some legitimacy gains for people who don't have any? And I go maybe back in the same sequence as before and give you the floor, Franak, to share your thoughts about this question. I'm not too lucky here with responses. Franak, I park you if you give me a sign when you're online or when you hear me. And maybe Olga, I see you and I think you hear me. Olga, what are your thoughts?
Да, смотрите, я хотела бы несколько моментов подчеркнуть, отреагировать на то, что было сказано. Госпожа Урсула сказала про то, что выборы либо бойкот. Очевидно, что, конечно же, проактивная позиция – это участие в процессах, которые есть в стране. И важно иметь возможность доносить свой месседж и свою повестку. Вы видите, что в этом году впервые в Беларуси местные выборы фактически будут отменены, скорее всего, по решению парламента. Планируется внесение изменений в Конституцию, и впервые в Беларуси это будет произведено не посредством референдума. И это означает, что власть продолжает не слышать белорусов, которые сегодня выступают против единовластия, они хотят участвовать в принятии решений. Режим в очередной раз показывает, что он единолично может переносить любые процессы, не ориентируясь на мнение людей. По сегодняшнему законодательству, которое есть в Беларуси, бойкот выборов запрещен. И, конечно, я как политик, который принимал участие в разных кампаниях, мы участвовали в бойкоте и участвовали в процессах. Я считаю, что когда мы не участвуем в процессах, мы учим людей не участвовать в принятии решений. Это не проактивная позиция. Мы должны иметь возможность доносить свой месседж, и как раз-таки выборы – это один из таких инструментов. И если касаться вопроса изменений законодательства, то, конечно, демократическое сообщество уже много лет от выборов к выборам и посредством кампании наблюдения, права выбора и других все время свои предложения вносило. И вы знаете, что и после выборов 2016 года и 2019 года есть рекомендации миссии ОБСЕ, но, к сожалению, на сегодняшний момент ни одни из них в Беларуси не выполнены. И здесь скорее вопрос для меня, как для юриста, правоприменительной практики. Я убеждена в том, что даже при действующем законодательстве сегодня в Беларуси можно провести честные выборы. На это нет политической воли. Сегодня ничего не мешает посчитать голоса честно, показать каждый бюллетень, но на это нет политической воли. И, конечно же, для того, чтобы говорить о стандартах выборов в Беларуси, к ним в первую очередь должно быть доверие у белорусов. А доверие может быть только в том случае, если мы понимаем, что ЦИК и другие участковые комиссии сформированы из представителей разных субъектов, не только от провластных структур. И мы понимаем, что весь процесс не начинается с задержания кандидатов, и репрессий, а мы видим, что есть свобода, есть возможность использовать средства массовой информации, есть возможность открытого и гласного подсчета голосов. И это реально. На это нет политической воли. И как раз-таки, когда мы говорим про переговоры и про санкции, так вот, санкции – это инструмент давления или принуждения к этим переговорам. А сам инструмент разрешения – это переговоры, когда есть предмет переговоров, есть понятная повестка, и как раз-таки эту повестку возможно формировать, когда мы понимаем, что есть предпосылки. Сегодня, к сожалению, в условиях жутких репрессий и увеличения количества политзаключенных сложно говорить про переговорный процесс. Это очень сложно, потому что, с другой стороны, со стороны власти мы не видим этой готовности совместного разрешения кризиса. Я еще раз хочу подчеркнуть, что это не кризис демократического сообщества, это кризис всего белорусского общества, и преодолевать эти препятствия нужно всей стране. Пока мы видим только сдачу государственности или разрушение институтов со стороны власти, и не более того. Поэтому, мне кажется, стоит задуматься сегодня всем, кто живет в Беларуси, независимо от политических взглядов, что мы едины в том, чтобы сохранить и развивать государство под названием Республика Беларусь, а не каким-то образом что-то разрушать, это точно. Спасибо большое.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think we certainly all agree that the political will is key, that it's not there now. At the same time, what you say, I think, is important. Possible postponement of local elections, if I understand correctly. Also, the celebrations for 9th of May were postponed or not held. So there's a real fear of any kind of mobilization. And that's important to note, I think, that this current regime has no confidence in any of these processes anymore and is afraid that they could all go wrong. Franak, you are back. Let us know what you think.
Sure, I will start with local elections. This is definitely the sign of the weakness of Lukashenko and the sign that he is afraid of any form of activities. Я переключусь на беларускую, зноў пачаў па-ангельску. Ясна, што Лукашенко не хоча актыўнага грамадства. Тыя структуры, якія з'явіліся ўвосень прошлага года, гэта і ёсць натуральная грамадзянская супольнасць, якой ён не здольны нічога процівапаставіць, акрамя гвалту. Мы упэўненыя, што новыя прэзідэнцкія выбары і парламенцкія выбары сумешчаныя, яны могуць адбыцца, яшчэ раз паўтару, вельмі хутка, і угледзячы на тое, як развіваецца сітуацыя імкліва пасля самалёта з Романом Пратасевічем, гэта таксама і працэс дыялогу і перамоваў будзе імкліва развівацца. Наша з вами задача – гэта падрыхтаваць умовы, каб у нас дакладна быў, напрыклад, Себастьян Курц, адказны медыятар, каб у нас быў Меркель і Макрон, гатовыя ўзяць на сябе адказнасць гарантамі выніку перамоваў, каб у нас быў Роберто Монтелло, парламенцкая асамблея ОБСЕ, гатовы арганізаваць пляцоўку, месца, фармат перамоваў і быў гатовы пераможчык. Многія параўноўваюць гэта з перамовамі ў Польшчы, многія параўноўваюць з Украінай, якая нікуды не давяла. Можна параўнаць з перамовамі ў паўднёвай Афрыцы, калі вырашалі пытанне пасля апартэіду. І там таксама быў крытычны момант. І таксама не было падставаў для прымірэння. Але яны стварылі гэты перамоўны працэс, запушчаны, які ў выніку прывёў паўднёвую Афрыку да дэмакратыі. Нам трэба адно іншае не выключае, тут я з Пал Палычам згодны. Ціск, ён толькі ўзмацняе нашыя перагаворныя пазіцыі. Ніхто не мае сумневу, што Лукашенко будзе добрым перагаворшчыкам. Нам амаль няма шансу, што ён у прынцыпе на гэтыя перамовы пойдзе. Хутчэй за ўсё перамовы будуць з тымі людзьмі, якія вакол рэжыму прадстаўляюць розныя групы інтарэсаў. Это бізнес, сілавікі, мясцовыя чыноўнікі. Это тыя людзі, якія так ці інакш будуць прымаць удзел у пабудове новай Беларусі і якія падзяляюць нашыя каштоўнасці. Дыялог і перамовы, у прынцыпе, гэта розныя рэчы. Перамовы – гэта частка дыялогу, але гэты дыялог не выключае перамовы. Перамовы маюць канкрэтную задачу. Гэта вось гэтыя выбары, якія задаволяць усе бакі і закрыюць пытанне, базісную праблему фальсіфікаваных выбараў у 2020 годзе. А дыялог дапаможа вырашыць пытанне справядлівасці, прымірэння ў грамадстве, прыцягнення да адказнасці, трыбуналу, суда, міжнароднага ці унутрыбеларускага. Таму мы зараз, давайце, усе гэтыя праблемы, мы іх акрэсліваем цяпер, каб калі надыдзе момант, а ён надыдзе ў бліжэйшыя месяцы, хутчэй за ўсё. У нас будзе падрыхтаваныя, дакладна разбітыя ўсе праблемы, і мы зможам іх хутка павырашаць. Але адказнасці за злачынствы рэжыму ніхто не пазбегне. Гэта наша прынцыповая пазіцыя.
Thank you very much. And I pass over to Pavel Latushka. So you know the scene very well also, and how does this discussion sound to you about, possible openings, maybe the scenario of an opening towards some negotiations where, you have to talk about minimum conditions or something like that.
Спасибо за слово. Я хотел бы тоже поддержать опять Ольгу Ковалькову. У нас так сегодня сходится позиция. Это как раз показывает еще раз единство демократических сил. Вопрос доверия к избирательной системе и доверия к самому институту выборов в Беларуси. И это ключевой вопрос. Я не считаю, что сегодня главным является изменение законодательства избирательного. Я считаю, что самым главным является восстановление доверия к избирательной системе и структурам, которые обязаны обеспечить выборы. Это исполнительная власть, которая сегодня всеми незаконными способами пытается вмешаться в процесс выборов. Это идеологическая власть, средства массовой информации, которые являются несвободными, недемократическими и влияют на избирательный процесс Беларуси. И это сами институты, которые отвечают за организацию выборов. Центральная избирательная комиссия, окружные избирательные комиссии и местные участковые комиссии. И вот здесь произошел колоссальный подрыв доверия к этим всем институтам, которые фактически стали одним целым, представляющим режим и работающим для достижения одного результата – обеспечения фиктивной победы нелегитимной власти в любой избирательной кампании. До тех пор, пока не будет восстановлено доверие к ним, невозможно говорить в принципе о выборах в нашей стране. Возможно ли говорить о выборах, когда кандидат в президенты, собирающий подписи под свою кандидатуру, в последующем лица, которые подписали, оставили подпись в его поддержку, увольняются с мест работы, репрессируются. И примеры этому вот буквально на прошлой неделе 18 сотрудников Национального центра законодательства Беларуси были уволены по той причине, что они когда-то подписались за кандидатуру Виктора Бабарика. Можно ли говорить о доверии к избирательной системе, когда сегодня в Беларуси уже де-факто нет свободных средств массовой информации? Последний мощный информационный ресурс Тутбай был закрыт, ликвидирована его деятельность в Беларуси, а руководство и журналисты посажены в тюрьму. Соответственно, возможность представления альтернативной точки зрения невозможно. Возможно ли иметь доверие к участковым, окружным или центральной избирательной комиссии, которые занимаются фальсификацией выборов, когда невозможно осуществить наблюдение за выборами в Беларуси? Поэтому давайте признаем, что сегодня без изменения власти в стране невозможно проведение выборов в Беларуси. Это абсолютно невозможно. Это нельзя будет назвать ни выборами, ни избирательной кампанией, ни избирательным процессом. Это все будет фактически назначение тех людей, которых захочет власть, как в парламент, так и в местные органы власти. И это должна понять Европа, это должны понять все эксперты. Поэтому я вновь вас возвращаю к главному. Главным является это изменение политическое в Беларуси, когда с политической арены уйдет человек, ответственный за репрессии и подавление, и созданная им система рухнет. Вот только тогда можно говорить о выборах, и только тогда мы можем с вами обсуждать различные элементы, связанные с изменением законодательства, проведением контроля и так далее. Но я еще раз повторю, я убежден, что действующее законодательство при наличии политической воли, которой сейчас внутри страны нет, позволяет нам провести достаточно высокого уровня демократические выборы в стране. В последующем мы можем заниматься усовершенствованием законодательства, исходя из политических преобразований. Если это будет парламентско-президентская республика, соответственно, будет изменяться избирательное законодательство. И опыт, накопленный европейскими структурами, опыт, накопленный БДИПЧ, ОБСЕ, безусловно, будет для нас важен, и я не вижу здесь препятствий, что он будет имплементирован достаточно быстро. Способ изменения ситуации, обеспечения новых выборов только один – признание Лукашенко с точки зрения международного права преступником, международным террористом, когда у него не будет иного выбора, и он должен будет уйти от власти. Произойдет ли это быстро, зависит от белорусов, медленно также зависит от белорусов, но это главная цель, на которую нужно сконцентрироваться. Поэтому говорить сегодня о возможности проведения при Лукашенко через какой-то даже инструмент предварительного диалога выборов считаю бессмысленным занятием, потому что все равно эти выборы будут не свободными, не демократическими и реально не представляющими политические взгляды белорусов. А они очень четко сейчас показывают, что более 80% белорусов не поддерживают режим в нашей стране.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. I think there's agreement that this is not the moment to say one starts negotiation, because there is no opposite side to do that at this point. But I would maybe give the floor back to Ambassador Gacek. The question being one of scenarios. So what if a scenario occurs where there is some negotiation with somebody who wants to not lose everything, but is willing to give a little bit, and what should that give be? And therefore, to put it in more simple words, what would be minimum conditions if we assume that elections tomorrow wouldn't look like election in Sweden, perhaps, but what would be an acceptable minimum of election conditions if such a possibility opens? So what should one ask for in a negotiation? What would be the bottom line? What would be the red lines, the good enough, if you want? Ambassador, what do you think?
Thank you, Michael. Well, it's very disheartening to hear that local elections might be cancelled. It's just another indication, I think, that we're a long way from getting to a stage where Lukashenko wants to sit down and negotiate, that he feels that he has no other option. He obviously has a lot of options in his own perception at the moment. I think the biggest danger would be that if he was pressed and felt that he did have to make some kind of concession, that that the international community and the Belarusian people would be hoodwinked or appeased into feeling that a little bit of window dressing and a little bit of tinkering with the electoral code is going to be sufficient to conduct elections that come up to international standards. There's much more to an election than what is written in the electoral code and what the Central Election Commission, even if it is an independent one, is able to do. Without the possibility of voters making an informed choice, there can be no free election. So whilst there is not sufficient access to independent media and independent opinion, it is possible that even a reformed electoral code could lead to the same result. I mean, people in Belarus, they're dissatisfied with what they have, but it is always possible at the last minute to throw populist incentives in front of maybe less educated, less politically aware, less motivated voters. So I would say an independent access to opinion where they can make an informed choice. Secondly, the opposition must be able to campaign unhindered. If the reaction to somebody who looks as if they are in with a chance of having some kind of decent result is to throw them into prison, then you must have recourse to an independent and impartial judiciary. Who can get somebody like that out of prison if the judges are not willing to treat cases on their merits? So without reform of the judiciary, without certainty of an independent judiciary, the electoral process is extremely difficult for an election to be undertaken in a democratic way. And finally, this was mentioned, voters must be free to cast their vote or to collect signatures or to express their political preference in a way which is free from intimidation. We cannot demand heroic actions of the average Belarusian citizen, people who have jobs, wives, husbands, children. Some people will be brave enough, will be determined enough, but we cannot demand it of everybody. So we have to ensure that the system is safe for them, that they can cast their vote confident that the vote is cast in secrecy and that there is no intimidation or reprisal for openly proclaiming your political preferences, which of course you do once you put your signature to a candidate list, once you actively participate in a candidate's campaign or actually campaign yourself. There is much more to an election than just the electoral code, just like there is much more to observation, which always comes as a surprise for the uninitiated, than just watching people drop ballots in ballot boxes and then for the counting and tabulation of those votes. If that was the case, ODIHR would not be observing the whole process from the day a campaign kicks off and even sometimes earlier. I do recognize the important role already citizen observers have played in elections, especially in 2020 when ODIHR was not able to be present. And I also share your frustrations that your recommendations, just like the recommendations of ODIHR, have not been acted on and have not been, there has been no reaction to so many of them. So I think I didn't even go into the area of negotiations because I just felt that the situation at this moment is not ready for negotiation. But as you said, Michael, things can turn in a moment and sometimes very small actions can bring an avalanche. And so that's why I also thought about the preparation that can be made given the scenario that I think currently exists. And that is one where still there is not the will, the political will for negotiation. And And if there was the political will to hold free and fair elections, it is quite possible that it could be done under the auspices of the law as it stands, maybe just ensuring that the election administration was independently elected and gave a guarantee of impartiality and restored some confidence in the system. So no easy answers, I'm sorry, to this one.
Thank you very much. I see that we have 10 more minutes in this session. From what you said, I would maybe put one more question, quite basic, on the table, which is it even useful to discuss these scenario details? I hear a lot of skepticism whether it is. At the same time, I see many people working on those scenarios. I have my own opinion, which I reserve maybe to the end of the session. And I would just invite all panelists who want to answer this question or comment on anything else in this session to raise your hands now. And this would be then also your final statement in this panel. And I think Olga already raised her hand, and anybody else from the panel can also put up their hands for further contributions. Olga, please.
Да, спасибо. На самом деле я хотела бы обратить внимание еще на один важный аспект, который мы сегодня немного затронули. На мой взгляд, он тоже не менее важен, чем переговоры, давление, новые выборы. Это наращивание ресурсов. Это означает, что мы, как демократическое сообщество, должны растить демократию непрерывно. Ее нельзя насадить сверху, ее можно вырастить только внутри белорусского общества. И как раз-таки победить и противостоять вызовам как внутренним, так и внешним может крепкое, структурированное, организованное гражданское общество. И мне кажется, как раз в прошлом году это год начала становления и формирования его как субъекта. И как раз-таки, мне кажется, на этом тоже стоит сделать фокус. И хочу также сказать, что мы этим занимаемся, потому что вот сегодня говорили о децентрализации, это, конечно же, очень важный аспект, потому что в прошлую кампанию, чем ее отличие от предыдущих, в политику пришли подходы бизнеса, европейского бизнеса, а это и есть подходы демократии. И вот с этого как раз и начинается путь. И лидеры, они как раз в эту кампанию, они шли за людьми, они как раньше, да, вели людей. Это тоже отличительная особенность формирования гражданского общества. И сейчас надо сказать, что если раньше, например, выборы были исключительно лежали в области переговоров между международными организациями, политическими лидерами оппозиции и власти внутри страны, то сейчас вопрос свободных выборов или выбора власти – это национальный вопрос. Люди хотят выбирать себе власть. И мне кажется, как раз если мы будем думать в направлении еще как помочь медиа, как помочь гражданскому обществу, это тоже очень важный аспект, который не нужно забывать, потому что мы должны делать политику здесь и сейчас, потому что как раз-таки, когда мы говорим про сценарии, мы не знаем, как будет развиваться ситуация, какие еще черные лебеди появятся, но у нас есть политические процессы, в которых мы точно должны принимать участие, и мы должны формировать политическое поле и структуры, которые будут бороться за власть в Беларуси. Спасибо.
Thank you. And last invitation, would any other panelists like to comment more? Yes, Franak, please.
Я так само падсумую нашу дыскусію. Я думаю, што ўсе згодныя, што выбары гэта выйсце з крызісу. Шляхі да выбара могуць быць розныя. Нам неабходна ствараць умовы для того, каб выбары адбыліся. Ствараць умовы гэта значыць працаваць з аднаго боку і з заканадаўствам, але з іншага боку і ўзнаўляць законнасць у краіне, таму што ў Беларусі татальнае беззаконне пануе, і якія б рэформы зараз мы не абмяркоўвалі, ўсё роўна, калі няма законнасці, падсправаздачнасці, калі будзе рэжым Лукашэнкі, ён на любыя законы наплюе і злоўжые, каб застацца яшчэ больш пры ўладзе. Таму мы працуем унутры Беларусі, нарошчваем рэсурсы, як кажа Ольга. Мы вяртаем законнасць праз прыцягненне вінаватых да адказнасці. Мы будуем грамадзянскую супольнасць, палітычныя структуры, протадзяржаўныя структуры, структуры грамадскага кантролю, якія маглі б нам дапамагчы ў арганізацыі і падвядзенні да того, что мы называем трансформацией, демократичные перемены. Мы нарощиваем досвед выборчы, ствараем переговорные группы на первом этапе, на другим спецыялістаў для правядзення выбараў, гатуем выбарчых спецыялістаў, тых, хто могуць увайсці ў ЦВК, ў рэгіянальныя выбарчыя структуры. Мы працуем з міжнароднай супольнасцю, каб міжнародная супольнасць мела адзіную пазіцыю, што выбары неабходныя. І гэта ў першую чаргу АБСЕ, але не толькі. Нам патрэбныя і дзяржаўныя стейкхолдеры, і ўрады, якія гатовыя быць як гарантамі, так і медыятарамі, як да падрыхтоўкі да выбараў, так і пасля правядзення выбараў, каб не адбылася яшчэ адна захоп улады і злоўжыванне выбарчай працэдурай ці вынікамі выбараў. І яшчэ раз дзякую ўсім панелістам, і я думаю, што момант, што выбары павінны адбыцца як найхутчэй, все падзяляюць. Я б хацеў гэта падкрэсліць таксама для пратаколу. Выбары ў гэтым годзе як мэта, і мы гатовыя размаўляць на ўсіх узроўнях, каб гэта стала рэальнасцю. Дзякую.
Thank you very much for the closing remarks. And Ambassador Gacek, I think you also wanted to add something.
Yes, I'm unmuted. So a very final sentence. It's very encouraging to hear that despite the repressions, despite the courage this takes, there is a vast reservoir of increasingly disgruntled citizens. And the unprecedented level of public protest is a testimony to this. So tapping into that reservoir, which is effectively campaigning, it's also campaigning, but also addressing the final point that I mentioned in my opening remarks, and that is working with civil society to have some role in the election process whenever it takes place. Working with those disgruntled citizens could actually be the easiest way of addressing two of those suggestions that I made. And so I hope that we end on, despite the extremely complex and challenging situation in which our Belarusian colleagues and friends find themselves in, that we nevertheless end on some note of optimism from this panel, that this situation is nevertheless different from my own experiences, for example, working in the European Parliament or working closely with Belarusian opposition when I was head of the rapporteur group on democracy amongst the ambassadors in the Council of Europe. So let's hope that despite the challenges, the situation does have a spark of optimism somewhere along the line.
Thank you very much. I would subscribe very much to that. Of course, we all look for this moment of renewed optimism on the situation in Belarus. From my perspective, I see a very strong movement still, even though it's less visible on the ground. But it gives me the sense that the regime has lost its population, and I think Ambassador knows that well from Poland in the 80s, that it's just the facade that's left. The big question is how long it remains standing. But what encourages me is that there is so much thinking and preparation, if you want, by opposition figures and by those who work towards democracy. And I think what this event tries to do is a little bit to look at possible eventualities and what would be the game plans that you need in those moments, and to have zero naivety about those situations and to have very high technical skills. And I see a lot of good technicians, if you want, on all these questions. And tomorrow we go even deeper into these so-called technical issues, which are all, of course, very political. And I invite you all to join us tomorrow, starting at 3 o'clock with two very interesting panels, 3 o'clock Minsk time in Western Europe, or in Central Europe, Warsaw, that would be 2 o'clock like today morning in the US. I hope to see all of you again at that time. I want to thank again Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, her team, for holding this, for the privilege of our organization to be part of it. I want to thank International IDEA, and maybe special thanks to IFES, because they organized all this, and we all know it's really a lot of work to do technical preparations of these kind of online meetings. So I want to thank you as well. And before you leave the meeting, please let me hand over for the final closure to Alexander. Thank you very much. Very good to meet you.
Большое спасибо, Михаил. Большое спасибо участникам последней панельной дискуссии. Франк, Ольга, Павел, Уршула. Было на самом деле интересно и я считаю, очень полезно. Дало нам очень много идей для того, чтобы, может быть, в будущем продолжать эти дискуссии, и политические, и более технические. Как уже сказал Михаил, завтра мы всех приглашаем на продолжение этой конференции. Завтра у нас 2 рабочие сессии. Первая, посвященная краткосрочным подходам к реформированию избирательного процесса. Вторая, посвященная более долгосрочным подходам. Я хочу еще раз поблагодарить соорганизаторов этой конференции, IFES, DRI, Международную идею. Особенно упомянуть с большой благодарностью участников панели высокого уровня сегодня и Беату, которая модерировала. Я думаю, что больше всего меня впечатляет и не только уровень и глубина наших дискуссий сегодня, но и то, что мы настолько четко придерживаемся временных рамок, которые мы сами себе поставили. Это еще раз, мне кажется, показывает, что у нас есть не только способность обсуждать на хорошем уровне такие сложные вопросы, но еще и техническая способность придерживаться всех правил. Большое спасибо всем. Я хочу напомнить всем, что вам нужно использовать тот же самый линк для того, чтобы попасть на конференцию завтра. Нового линка не будет. Пожалуйста, тот же самый линк, и вы попадете на конференцию в качестве участников или панелистов, участников панелей дискуссионных. На этом мы заканчиваем первый день. Всем большое спасибо еще раз. Большое спасибо переводчикам. И увидимся завтра в 3 часа дня по минскому времени.
Спасибо. Хорошего дня.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you all very much.